The room is quiet, too quiet. A single flame trembles on a desk of dark wood, its light spilling across yellowed pages that look older than memory itself. Outside, the night is still. But within these walls, the silence seems alive, as if it listens. A clock ticks faintly in the corner, its hands dragging time forward second by second. But here, in this space between shadows and flame, the question hangs heavy in the air. What does it mean when words spoken more than 1,000 years ago begin to echo against our present day? The human story has always been a tapestry woven from patterns. We build empires, then lose them. We make discoveries only to forget them. We rise, fall, and rise again. Yet hidden in this rhythm is something stranger, a whisper, a warning, a prophecy. It is one thing for history to repeat itself, but another for an ancient voice to foretell our present in exact detail. And tonight, we turn the page on a mystery that has followed us across 14 centuries. Imagine a desert night, 400 years ago. The sky was the same as the one above us now, spattered with stars that seemed eternal. In a small gathering, someone spoke words that would be carried forward, preserved in fragile memory and ink. Those words would outlive kings, outlast dynasties, and survive centuries of war, translation, and silence. Yet here they are, returning not as distant myth, but as sentences we can trace against headlines, as warnings that mirror our world word for word. This is not the first time humanity has brushed against the uncanny. Across every civilization, people have claimed glimpses of the future, visions carved in stone, whispered by oracles, buried in scripture. Some prophecies are vague, like dreams. That can be bent to fit any outcome. But some strike like lightning, clear, sharp, undeniable. These are the ones that disturb us, because they leave little room for doubt. What do we make of them? Are they coincidences? The mind's desperate attempt to find order in chaos? Or are they clues carefully planted across time? Tonight we will not try to prove or disprove prophecy. Instead, we will walk slowly into the labyrinth of history, following the faint thread of a voice carried over centuries. We will look at the world in which this prophecy was spoken, the ways it was guarded, the interpretations it gathered, and finally, the signs that suggest its time may be now. There is something haunting about a prophecy that refuses to fade. For most predictions, the years wear them down until they crumble into superstition. But this one is different. It has endured. Like a seed buried in the earth, it has waited. Waited through the collapse of empires, through the turning of calendars, through the rise of technologies its author could never have imagined. And now, in a century of machines, satellites, and screens that never sleep, its words are waking again. Picture for a moment the strangeness of hearing a 400-year-old sentence in the language of your own life. It is as if a stranger from the past is standing in your living room, speaking directly to you, describing your fears, your world, your tomorrow. That feeling is not merely unsettling, it is destabilizing. Because if words from the past can still shape our present, then maybe the line between history and destiny is thinner than we think. But before we can understand what this prophecy says, we must learn where it came from. Words are never born in isolation. They come from a time, a place, a struggle. They are shaped by wars, by faith, by the lives of people who carried them, in secret. To trace a prophecy is not only to follow words, but to follow the souls who believed in them, who copied them in ink, who hid them in caves, who whispered them to their children. As we journey, the path will not always be comfortable. Some parts of this prophecy sound like warnings, warnings of unrest, of division, of shadows spreading across the earth. Others sound like promises that from within the chaos, patterns can be understood, even guided. And perhaps that is why such words survive, not only because they predict, but because they give meaning, and humans cling to meaning as they do to breath. There will be those who scoff. They will say prophecies are only mirrors, reflecting whatever we choose to see. They will point to mistranslations, to history's tendency to exaggerate, to the danger of bending words into whatever shape we desire. And they are not wrong to be cautious. But even skepticism cannot erase the shiver that runs down the spine. When a 400-year-old phrase reappears, letter for and doubt between chance and fate. Tonight, as the candle burns low, we step across that threshold together. Slowly, carefully, we will open the chambers of this story, one by one, and listen to what they have preserved. The air is heavy, the silence deep, as if history itself is waiting for us to ask the next question. And that question is not whether prophecies are real, but why this one in particular has survived. Why has it refused to be forgotten? Why does it rise again in moments of upheaval? Why does it feel, now more than ever, like its time has come? We are about to follow a thread woven through deserts and temples, through forgotten manuscripts and fragile whispers, through centuries of forgetting and remembering. At its end lies not just a prophecy, but a mirror, a reflection of who we are and who we may yet become. And so, let us lean closer to the flame, let us unroll the parchment of time, and let us listen to a voice carried across 14 centuries. For to understand the future, we must first journey backward, to a moment when words were spoken not just for their own age, but for ours. There are moments in history when a single voice seems to carry far beyond the span of its own age. Most words are fragile things, spoken, heard, and forgotten within the breath of a moment. But some words, rare, almost miraculous, cling to time itself, as though they were carved into the marrow of history. They echo across generations, whispered from parent to child, preserved in ink on fading parchment, or inscribed in the stone of memory. The prophecy we now turn to belongs to that strange class of utterances that outlives both the speaker and the world that first heard it. It is a voice across centuries, a thread woven into the fabric of time, and it calls to us now with a clarity that is both haunting and undeniable. To understand this prophecy, we must imagine its first breath. Picture, if you will, a chamber lit by wavering oil lamps, their glow trembling against walls of clay and reed. A man, perhaps a sage, perhaps a leader, perhaps an oracle whose name, they would later be cloaked in reverence, leans forward, his words spilling not in haste but with a careful weight, as though he knows they are not his alone. Around him sit listeners, disciples, scribes, or common folk, unsure whether they are hearing a warning, a revelation, or merely the fevered dream of a restless mind. Outside, the world continues in its ordinary rhythm. Markets buzz, horses tread dust, and children laugh. But within that chamber something extraordinary takes place. A voice becomes eternal. The prophecy was not written in the grand halls of kings or etched into the marble of empires. It did not arrive gilded in wealth or announced by the trumpets of armies. Like so many truths that endure, it began in obscurity. Perhaps on parchment thin as breath, perhaps on a scrap of papyrus buried beneath heavier tomes, perhaps first carried only by the lungs of men who dared to memorize it before ink fixed it in place. Yet even in its humble beginnings, it bore a quality that made it impossible to forget. There was a resonance to the words, a cadence that struck its hearers not as a human composition, but as something more, something whispered from beyond the veil of ordinary time. Who was the voice? Historians argue, theologians debate, skeptics dismiss, and believers bow their heads in awe. Some say it was the voice of a prophet, a man so attuned to the divine currents of existence that his words carried not only wisdom but foresight. Others claim it was the utterance of a mystic, someone who read patterns in the stars, in dreams, or in the tremors of the earth itself, crafting warnings from the symbols only he could perceive. Still others, more cynical, suggest the prophecy was born of political maneuvering, a speech designed to unite, control, or manipulate, which only later took on the mask of eternity. But whatever the source, the power of the prophecy cannot be denied, for its survival across 14 centuries defies the ordinary erosion of memory. The prophecy itself, when first spoken, was simple enough in form. Its sentences were not labyrinths of obscure language, nor riddles so tangled they required endless decoding. Instead, it spoke plainly, so plainly, in fact, that its survival feels even more unsettling. It described events yet to come, events that at the time must have seemed impossible, absurd even. And yet, as the centuries unraveled, one thread after another fell into place exactly as the voice had foretold. There was no mistaking metaphor, no convenient reinterpretation to force coincidence into meaning. The words had been precise, and reality, against all expectation, had bent to meet them. The first record we have of this prophecy's existence comes from a manuscript, one worn and fragile, whose pages smell of dust and incense, whose ink has bled into the parchment with the slow hand of centuries. The scribe who copied it must have understood its weight, for he framed it not with commentary but with silence, as though to preserve its power untarnished. Later copies would emerge, scattered across lands and languages, each one slightly altered by the brush of a pen or the inflection of a tongue, but all carrying the same heartbeat. Scholars would pore over these copies, comparing them line by line, debating which words were original and which were later additions. Yet even amidst their disagreements, all could see that the spine of the prophecy, the unshakable core, remained unchanged. Imagine that moment of rediscovery. A scholar bent low in a dim library, pulling back the lid of a forgotten chest, his fingers brushing against a brittle page. As he begins to read, his breath quickens, for what lies before him is not merely history but a voice speaking directly into his present. The walls of the library seem to fade, and he feels himself caught between centuries, as though the speaker of old has turned his gaze to him and him alone. Such is the power of prophecy. It collapses time, making the past not past at all, but a living presence. Yet prophecy is never merely words on a page. It is belief. It is fear. It is the way. Those words shape the minds and choices of those who hear them. For every scribe who preserved the text, there was a community that listened, debated, whispered in awe, or dismissed it with nervous laughter. Some heard in the prophecy a warning that demanded repentance, a call to turn away from paths that would lead only to ruin. Others treated it as a weapon, wielding its authority to rally armies, justify wars, or claim divine favor. And still others, perhaps the wisest of all, sat silently, neither dismissing nor exploiting, but simply wondering, what if this is true? Over the centuries, the prophecy became like a river, winding its way through different lands and peoples, absorbing new meanings yet never losing its original flow. In one era, it was a text of comfort, a promise that chaos was not without purpose. In another, it was a shadow, a reminder that the darkest days were still ahead. Some carried it in songs and chants, others in footnotes of forgotten chronicles. At times it nearly disappeared, buried beneath dust, censored by kings or dismissed by scholars who considered themselves too modern to believe in such things. And yet, like a stubborn flame, it refused to be extinguished. Again and again it resurfaced, each time finding new listeners who swore it spoke directly to them. There is something profoundly unsettling in this endurance. Words are fragile. Yet these words refused fragility. They clung to time with a persistence that feels almost unnatural. One must ask, was it merely the devotion of human hands that kept them alive, or was there something within the words themselves, a power, an energy, a truth that demanded survival? Was the prophecy kept because people needed it, or because it needed to reach us? The tone of reverence lingers as the narrator reminds us, this is not just history, this is inheritance. When you hear the prophecy, you are not hearing a dead relic of the past. You are touching the same thread that countless before you have touched, stretching back through centuries, unbroken, unyielding. And so the prophecy is introduced, not as an artifact but as a living presence, a voice across centuries, still whispering, still urgent. As the section draws to a close, the narration slows, letting silence seep into the edges of the words. The listener is left leaning forward, caught between awe and unease, ready to step further into the story. For now the prophecy has been unveiled, its origins traced, its endurance recognized. But questions hang in the air, heavy as incense. Who truly spoke it? What forces preserved it? And most hauntingly of all, why now, after 1400 years, does it seem to be coming true word for word? The voice falls silent, but its echo lingers. The audience feels that they have not merely been told of a prophecy, but invited into its unfolding. And with that invitation, the path opens into the next chapter, where the world in which the prophecy was first spoken will come into focus, a world of shadow and upheaval, where history and mystery entwined to give the voice its first breath. The year was one of turbulence. The world 14 centuries ago was not a place of quiet order, but of fracture, hunger, ambition, and awakening. To step into that age is to step into a theater of shadows, empires trembling under their own weight, kingdoms clashing like waves upon rocks, a new faith stirring in the hearts of men and women who sought answers beyond what their ancestors had known. It was into this restless landscape that the prophecy was first breathed, a voice rising not in a vacuum but against a backdrop of fire and dust. To hear it without understanding its world would be to listen without ears. The deserts of Arabia, stretched wide and unbroken, seas of sand swallowing the horizon. Tribes moved as they always had, caravans snaking across the dunes, carrying spices, silks, and stories. At night, the stars burned brighter than any torch, constellations wheeling overhead as if they too were watchful witnesses to human striving. In these deserts, life was harsh but alive. Water was treasure, hospitality sacred, and memory long. It was here, in the half-lit edges of empire and obscurity, that the prophecy began to take shape. Yet Arabia was not alone in its restlessness. The whole world seemed caught in the shifting tide. To the west, the once mighty Roman Empire had already broken in two. The western half had collapsed into a patchwork of kingdoms and warlords, its marble ruins scavenged for stone, its legions reduced to memory. The eastern half, Byzantium, still stood proud, its capital of Constantinople gleaming with domes and mosaics, but even there shadows gathered. Wars at its borders, plagues that swept through its streets, and internal strife whispered that even an empire of faith and gold was not untouchable. In its courts, lit by candle and debate, emperors and bishops wrestled not only with politics, but with the mysteries of eternity, arguing over the very nature of God and man, as if truth could be written into law. Farther east, Persia's Sassanid Empire stretched across mountains and valleys, a rival to Byzantium in wealth and ambition. Its kings wore crowns heavy with jewels, and its palaces glimmered with silk curtains, incense, and carved stone. Yet Persia too was weary from war, locked in endless struggle with its Byzantine neighbor. Cities rose in splendor, only to burn in conquest, and men marched in armor more often than they tilled the earth. The Zoroastrian fire temples glowed. Flames tended carefully as symbols of order, but outside their walls chaos gnawed. Even mighty Persia, for all its grandeur, was fragile beneath its glittering mask. Northward, the steppes were alive with riders, nomadic tribes whose horses carried them like shadows across grasslands. These were people of speed, of arrows and thunder, sweeping into settled lands with raids that left towns smoldering. To the far east, China's dynasties rose and fell, their scholars recording omens in meticulous ink, while farmers watched the skies for storms, and emperors feared rebellion as much as foreign invasion. And beyond them in India, kingdoms pulsed with life, temples echoing with chants, markets alive with color. Yet even there, unrest stirred as trade shifted and borders shifted like wind-blown sand. It was a world in transition, a world in shadow. Old powers faltered, and new ones waited restlessly in the wings. Faiths intermingled, some fading, some spreading like wildfire. In Europe, Christianity was spreading, its cathedrals beginning to rise, while in the East, ancient beliefs and practices endured alongside newer revelations. In Arabia, tribal gods still commanded devotion, their idols guarded in shrines, yet whispers of a different truth began to circulate, whispers that spoke of one God above all others, unseen yet undeniable. The air seemed charged, as if history itself was drawing breath, preparing for something vast. Into such a world the prophecy was spoken. It was not a prophecy born of peace, but of upheaval. It was shaped by the anxieties of people who saw kingdoms crumble, who felt the weight of war pressing upon their villages, who knew famine and fire as close companions. To them, the future was not an abstract curiosity, it was survival itself. When they heard the prophecy, when they were told that events would unfold with precision, that certain upheavals had already been inscribed in the book of time, they did not take it as entertainment. They took it as a lifeline, a warning, a call to ready their hearts. Consider for a moment the candlelit temples of the age. In Byzantium, priests debated scripture by firelight, their chants echoing against high stone arches. In Persia, Zoroastrian priests tended sacred flames that never went out, symbols of order against the darkness. In India, saffron-robed monks recited verses that had traveled orally for centuries before ink claimed them. And in Arabia, beneath the open night sky, men told stories around fires, stories that carried not only memory, but mystery. The prophecy was part of this tapestry, whispered in a voice that seemed to reach beyond the speaker, as though history itself were using human lips to warn its children. The tension of the age cannot be overstated. Kingdoms rose like sparks from a flame and fell just as quickly. In the markets of Damascus, Cairo, or Ctesiphon, traders exchanged more than goods, they exchanged rumors. Tales of plagues sweeping cities, of kings slain in battle, of stars burning bright in strange patterns. Every event was seen not only as history, but as omen, a sign that the heavens were restless. The prophecy then was not heard in isolation, but within this larger climate of dread and expectation. It did not need to convince its audience that the world was unstable. They were living that truth each day. What it offered was not the knowledge that disaster would come, but that disaster had purpose, that it was not random chaos, but part of a story already written. The courts of kings, too, were steeped in uncertainty. Picture a royal hall, its marble floor reflecting the glow of torches, its pillars hung with tapestries. Courtiers whisper in corners, generals argue over maps, and the king himself sits heavy on his throne, aware that every decision could mean the preservation or destruction of his crown. Into such halls, the prophecy sometimes crept, carried by merchants, priests, or spies. Imagine the unease of a ruler hearing words that seemed to mirror his own fears, that his empire was not eternal, that another power would rise, that even the strongest throne might one day be dust. Some kings dismissed it, scoffing at superstition. Others listened in silence, their faces unreadable, yet their hearts quickening with unease. But beyond the thrones and courts, in villages and deserts, the prophecy carried a different kind of power. To the common folk, it was not about empires, but about their own lives. A farmer hearing that famine would come readied his storehouses. A mother hearing of war clutched her child tighter at night. A trader hearing of new powers rising adjusted his routes, seeking safety in the shifts of history. The prophecy, then, was not merely a text of kings, but a story that trickled into the hearts of the humble, shaping their choices in small but enduring ways. The imagery of the prophecy, too, belonged to its time. It spoke of fire and dust, of armies like waves, of stars that dimmed and brightened. Such images resonated with an audience who lived beneath unpolluted skies, who saw omens in comets and eclipses, who knew the devastation of fire and the hunger of drought. To them, the prophecy was not distant poetry, but vivid reality, painted in symbols they lived each day. When it spoke of kingdoms falling, they could recall villages burned. When it spoke of waters drying, they remembered cracked earth beneath their feet. And yet, for all its resonance, the prophecy carried something beyond mere reflection of fear. It carried precision. It was not vague enough to be forgotten, not broad enough to be dismissed as metaphor. It named events, patterns, and signs with such clarity that its audience could not help but lean closer. It promised that the turbulence they endured was not endless chaos, but part of a design. Whether they accepted or rejected that design, they could not ignore it. Thus, the age of the prophecy's birth was not merely a setting, but a character. In its own right, the deserts, the palaces, the marketplaces, the temples, all these gave shape to the prophecy, gave it language and urgency. The prophecy did not float above history. It was born in the dust and sweat of real people, tied to real wars, real famines, real questions of faith and survival. To separate it from its age would be to strip it of its blood and marrow. And so, when we speak of the prophecy's voice echoing across centuries, we must first remember the world that first heard it, a world in shadow, trembling between collapse and creation, a world where kingdoms were dust on the wind, and yet hope still burned. It was a world ready to listen, ready to be haunted, ready to believe that beyond the chaos of men lay the order of destiny. As the scene closes, the narrator's voice softens, almost a whisper. 1400 years ago, the world held its breath. Kingdoms clashed, faiths spread, empires tottered on the brink, and in the midst of that turmoil a voice spoke, not for its time alone, but for all time. To understand what it said, we must first understand the shadows it was born. Ian, the birth of a prophecy is only the beginning. Words, no matter how divine, are fragile things. Spoken into the air, they vanish as quickly as breath, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Yet across centuries this prophecy endured. It survived. Famine and fire, the fall of empires, the silence of deserts, the damp rot of libraries and the shifting tongues of men. It endured because there were those who refused to let it die, who treated words not as fleeting sounds, but as fire to be carried, sheltered, and passed on. To understand how we hold these words today, we must follow the journey of their preservation, a journey as precarious and mysterious as the prophecy itself. In its first moments, the prophecy lived only as a voice. It was spoken aloud, heavy, with conviction, as though the speaker knew he was breathing not for himself, but for all who would come after. Those who first heard it were struck not only by its content, but by the power with which it was spoken. Ancient peoples believed deeply in the weight of the spoken word. To utter something was to give it life, to bind it to the world. Silence could erase, but speech created. Thus, when the prophecy was first declared, it was not merely heard, it was etched into the memory of those present as if carved into stone. But memory is a delicate vessel. Tribes and families became the first guardians, carrying the words from generation to generation. Around firelight beneath starlit skies, the prophecy was recited with care, each syllable polished by repetition. Elders taught their sons, mothers taught their daughters, and storytellers ensured that the prophecy was never allowed to fade into vagueness. In this way, it became both history and ritual. When the prophecy was recited, listeners leaned forward, not daring to interrupt. Children grew up hearing it until the rhythm of its phrases lived in their bones. Oral tradition was not casual in those days. It was sacred. To forget a word was not merely a mistake, but a breach of duty, an insult. To those who had guarded the fire before you, imagine the desert night, the flicker of flames, the circle of faces, the hush as the elder begins. His voice rises and falls with practiced cadence, each phrase landing with gravity. Though no ink or parchment recorded the prophecy yet, the words were secure, locked in the vault of memory. Such was the power of oral preservation, that even in lands where parchment was scarce and ink costly, stories outlived empires. But time is ruthless, and oral tradition alone was never enough. Wars scattered families, famines silenced villages, and memory, no matter how strong, faded with death. The prophecy risked vanishing in the void between generations, and so, in time, hands reached for more permanent vessels. Words were caught on parchment, papyrus, vellum, carved into tablets of clay, or etched in ink that smelled of smoke and resin. Here begins the second life of the prophecy, the life of the manuscript. The act of writing was itself a sacred ritual. To set words upon a page was not a mere craft, but an invocation, a binding of sound into form. Scribes bent over their desks, quills sharpened, candles burning low. Every stroke was deliberate. They believed themselves to be not inventors, but vessels, their task not to create but to preserve. In dim chambers where silence was broken only by the scratching of pen on parchment, the prophecy was given its first visible body. Some manuscripts were plain, ink on coarse paper, hurriedly written by those who feared time's theft. Others were exquisite, gold leaf illuminating the letters, intricate designs curling around the margins, pigments crushed from lapis, and saffron staining the pages with color. In both, however, the intent was the same, to capture the voice of the prophecy so that it might echo long after the original breath had faded. Yet manuscripts are fragile too. Fire consumes, water warps, insects devour. Wars reduce libraries to ashes in a single night. The history of books is a history of loss, a litany of what has burned, and so the preservation of the prophecy was never guaranteed. At times only 1 or 2 copies remained, guarded in secrecy as kingdoms rose and fell around them. A single mistake, a single raid, could have erased it forever. That it endured speaks not of chance but of devotion. Who were these guardians? Some were monks in cloisters dedicating their lives to the copying of sacred texts. For them, every word was a prayer, every letter an offering. Others were scholars, gathering rare manuscripts into libraries hidden away in desert caves or mountain monasteries. Still others were wanderers, carrying a single scroll tucked into their clothing, risking death to keep it safe from rulers who feared its message. Each in their own way became keepers of fire, passing the spark to another before their hands grew cold. Hidden libraries tell their own stories. There are tales of scrolls walled up in desert caves, sealed against sand and time, of manuscripts buried beneath temple stones, awaiting discovery centuries later, of entire libraries carried across mountains on the backs of mules, smuggled away before invading armies could torch them. Each discovery of such caches, sometimes in fragments, sometimes miraculously whole, feels like the prophecy itself insisting on survival, as though the words had a will of their own, refusing to be forgotten. And there is suspense here too. For every prophecy that endured, how many were lost? How many words dissolved into dust, never to be heard again? Scholars speak of ghost texts, fragments hinted at in other writings, but whose full bodies are gone forever. Sometimes a single quotation in a later manuscript is all that remains, a sliver of a lost mountain of meaning. To read such fragments is to feel both awe and sorrow, awestruck at what has endured, sorrowful at what has vanished. That the prophecy we follow survived complete is itself a miracle, a triumph over time's cruelty. One must also consider the dangers of distortion. Oral tradition changes with the teller. Manuscripts can be copied with errors, sometimes innocent, sometimes deliberate. Scribes might alter a word, whether from haste, misunderstanding, or intent. Emperors might command that certain passages be removed, fearing the unrest they could stir. Religious leaders might adjust a phrase to align with doctrine. Thus, the prophecy's survival was not just a matter of endurance, but of fidelity. Was what we read today the same as what was spoken centuries ago? Or has it been altered, subtly reshaped, like a stone smoothed by water, until its original form is unrecognizable? This question haunts all sacred texts. Yet within the prophecy, there is a strange consistency, a resilience that seems to resist distortion. Where other traditions splintered into versions, this prophecy held steady, its core phrases repeating across manuscripts from different lands and different centuries with uncanny sameness. Skeptics call it coincidence. Believers call it proof of divine protection. Whatever the truth, the effect is undeniable. The prophecy emerges from the labyrinth of time not as a fractured whisper, but as a clear, insistent voice. Even so, mystery lingers. Who decided what form the prophecy should take? Who guarded the original scrolls? Was there a single manuscript revered and copied, or many competing versions that converged only later? These are questions scholars debate endlessly, poring over faded ink, comparing handwriting, weighing every dot and line. Each manuscript becomes a puzzle, a window not only into the words, but into the hands that shaped them. And every so often, a discovery unsettles the debate. A new fragment found, an older copy unearthed, a marginal note revealing a scribe's hesitation or devotion. The prophecy's history is still alive, still unfolding, as though it resists finality. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story is the sense of agency the prophecy itself seems to have. It survived against odds that defy reason. Fires that destroyed entire cities somehow spared the one building that housed it. Wars that left libraries in ashes still left behind a single scroll intact. Families carried it through exile, choosing to save the prophecy above gold, food, or even heirlooms. Again and again, chance leaned toward preservation, as though the prophecy carried within it a spark that refused to be extinguished. And so today, when we open a manuscript or listen to the echo of its oral recitation, we are not simply reading or hearing. We are entering into a chain of survival, linking us back to desert firesides, to candlelit scriptoria, to hidden libraries. We are not passive observers, but participants in its preservation. For by remembering it, by speaking it again, we too keep the fire alive. The prophecy, then, is more than words. It is a story of survival. It is proof that human beings, for all their wars and failings, can also be vessels of devotion and care. That across centuries, men and women, anonymous, forgotten by name, chose to carry a fragile flame through storm after storm so that it might burn still. And perhaps this is the true miracle, not only that the prophecy foretold what was to come, but that it endured long enough for us to know it. In every preserved word lies not only the echo of the one who first spoke it, but the countless hands, voices, and hearts that kept it alive. The prophecy is thus etched not only in ink and fire, but in the devotion of those who would not let it vanish. The prophecy had been spoken, carried, and preserved. It had survived the fragility of memory and the uncertainty of manuscripts, and by the time it settled into the rhythm of centuries, it had already taken on a life of its own. Yet survival is not the same as understanding. Words, even when clear, invite questions, and when those words are tinged with mystery, cloaked in symbols and painted in visions, they demand interpretation. For the prophecy to live in the hearts of generations, it had to be read, recited, and above all understood, even if that understanding was uncertain, fragmentary, or entirely contradictory. Thus, across the centuries, the prophecy became not only a preserved text, but a mirror in which people saw their fears, their hopes, and the shapes of their own times reflected back at them. In the earlier centuries after the prophecy was spoken, interpretation belonged mostly to the scholars. Picture them in dimly lit chambers, hunched over manuscripts whose ink had barely dried, whispering phrases aloud, as if to catch echoes of meaning in the sound itself. Theirs was not the world of hurried reading, but of slow, meditative immersion. A single sentence of the prophecy might occupy their minds for months, each word turned like a gem under different lights. To these early interpreters, the prophecy was not a riddle to be solved at once, but a horizon, ever distant, ever receding, yet always calling them forward. Some approached the prophecy with reverence, convinced it was divine truth. They passed each phrase as if it carried the weight of eternity, searching for hidden codes, symbolic patterns, or numerical harmonies. Others approached it with fear, believing it a warning rather than a promise, a declaration of catastrophe veiled in poetic form. Still others were more pragmatic, seeing in the prophecy a tool for power, a way to lend legitimacy to rulers or movements by claiming that their reign, their battles, or their reforms had already been foretold. In this way, the prophecy began to fracture, not in its text but in its interpretations. What was one voice became 1,000 echoes. The echoes reached beyond scholars. In royal courts, kings and princes summoned interpreters, desperate to know whether the prophecy spoke of them. A ruler beset by enemies might demand, "Does this passage not say I will triumph? Does it not promise my crown shall endure?" When the words could be bent to comfort, interpreters bent them eagerly. Yet when the prophecy seemed to cast a shadow, speaking of downfall, betrayal, or ruin, advisers often hesitated, offering gentler readings. For what king wished to hear that his fate had been sealed not in his armies or his gold, but in words spoken long before his birth? In these courts, interpretation was never neutral. It was political, strategic, even dangerous. A prophecy could exalt a ruler or doom him. To claim that a king fulfilled the prophecy was to surround him with divine aura. To suggest that the same prophecy predicted his fall was to risk death. Thus, interpreters walked a narrow path, cloaking their readings in careful ambiguity. They spoke in riddles of their own, offering layers of meaning so that whatever unfolded could later be claimed as proof of their wisdom. Meanwhile, outside the palaces and cloisters, the prophecy lived a different life, among the people. In villages, at markets, along dusty roads, whispers carried fragments of its words. Farmers spoke of it during planting, wondering if the rains it described would come in their lifetimes. Merchants traveling from town to town carried versions of the prophecy as stories, reshaped to fit each new audience. Mothers repeated it as cautionary tales to children, warning them against arrogance, or urging them toward hope. In such hands, the prophecy was not a scholarly puzzle but a living tale, woven into daily life, shaping the way ordinary men and women understood their place in history. For the poor and oppressed, the prophecy often became a source of comfort. Its words of coming change, of light arising from shadow, offered hope that their suffering was not endless. In the echo of its promises, they imagined freedom, justice, or divine intervention. For the powerful, however, the same prophecy stirred fear that upheaval might come, that their rule was temporary, that history itself was already written against them. The same words that lifted the weak could unsettle the mighty, proof of the prophecy's enduring paradox, that it contained both promise and threat, both dawn and dusk. As centuries passed, interpretations multiplied. In the medieval period, especially, scholars sought to systematize the prophecy, embedding it within broader traditions of theology and philosophy. In candlelit monasteries, monks copied not only the words of the prophecy, but commentaries upon it, layer upon layer of meaning, each scribe adding his gloss in the margins, each teacher leaving behind a trail of interpretation for his students. These commentaries sometimes grew larger than the prophecy itself, entire volumes of reflection and debate, like a vast conversation carried across generations. Some scholars believed the prophecy was allegorical, its images symbolic rather than literal. To them, desert sands and rising suns were not descriptions of actual events, but metaphors for spiritual journeys. Others argued fiercely that the prophecy was concrete, pointing to specific rulers, wars, or cities. Whenever great events shook the world, plagues, crusades, the rise and fall of empires, interpreters rushed back to the prophecy, scouring its lines for evidence that these events had been foreseen. Each catastrophe was claimed as fulfillment, each triumph read as confirmation. The prophecy became not a static text, but a lens through which history itself was interpreted. This created a dreamlike atmosphere, where the line between the prophecy and reality blurred. If famine struck, the prophecy had foretold it. If a hero rose, the prophecy had promised it. If disaster loomed, the prophecy had warned of it. In this way, belief in the prophecy wove itself into the very fabric of medieval consciousness. The world itself seemed enchanted, each event carrying the shimmer of inevitability, each shadow whispering echoes of words spoken long ago. Kings, too, leaned heavily on interpretation. Some claimed openly to be the chosen figures of the prophecy, surrounding themselves with scholars who confirmed their reading. Coronation ceremonies sometimes included recitations of prophetic lines, binding the ruler's reign to the ancient voice. Yet there was always unease, for the prophecy did not simply bless, it also warned. A ruler might be celebrated as the dawn of fulfillment, only to be later condemned as the shadow of its downfall. The prophecy could crown, but it could also dethrone. This ambiguity gave it power. Unlike decrees carved in stone, the prophecy remained fluid, pliable, open to reinterpretation in every age. And so it became a living dialogue, a kind of conversation between the past and the present. Each generation read itself into the prophecy, finding there the reflection of its fears and desires. In times of war, it became a weapon, rallying soldiers with the promise of destiny. In times of peace, it became a mirror, urging reflection on the fragility of fortune. Always it spoke, even when its words were uncertain. Dreamlike as this may seem, there was also darkness. For every hopeful reading there were fearful ones. Some believed the prophecy foretold apocalypse, that its imagery of fire and shadow was not metaphor, but destiny. Preachers thundered from pulpits, warning congregations that the end was near, pointing to earthquakes, eclipses, or plagues as proof. These fiery interpretations spread fear through towns and villages, convincing many that they lived on the edge of time itself. In such moments, the prophecy was not a comfort, but a burden, pressing heavily on the hearts of those who heard it. And yet even this fear carried its own power. It bound communities together, urging repentance, solidarity, or resilience. In their shared fear, people also found shared purpose, shaping societies in ways both subtle and profound. The prophecy was thus not only a text but a force, shaping how people acted, how they worshipped, how they governed, and how they endured. One can imagine the atmosphere of those centuries. Scholars hunched in candlelit studies, kings pacing. In gilded halls, peasants huddled in taverns or around fires, all whispering of destiny. The prophecy was everywhere and nowhere, present in manuscripts, in sermons, in stories told by travelers, in the dreams of those who believed themselves chosen. It was not static, but alive, like a shadow that shifted as the light of history moved. And in that shadow, people saw themselves. They projected their hopes, their fears, their longings, their doubts. The prophecy, after all, was never only about the future. It was about the present, about making sense of the chaos of life, about weaving a thread of meaning through the unpredictability of existence. Its echo in the dust of centuries was the echo of humanity itself, seeking order, yearning for hope, trembling at destiny. That is why the prophecy endured, not only as preserved words but as living interpretation. It was less a book than a conversation, less a scroll than a song. And though scholars debated, kings commanded, and peasants whispered, all were united in one thing. They leaned in, they listened, they believed. The prophecy became a mirror, and in its shifting reflection, entire centuries dreamed. There comes a time in the life of every story when its voice grows faint, when echoes fade and silence gathers around words once believed immortal. The prophecy, so alive in whispered debates, in royal halls, in the dusty chatter of marketplaces, entered such a silence. Its presence, once so immediate and stirring, began to wither under the weight of shifting centuries. Where once it was spoken with reverence, it was now neglected. Where once it sat at the center of imagination, it slipped into the margins. It did not die, for words such as these never truly die, but it disappeared, hidden beneath layers of forgetfulness, suppression, and destruction. And in this disappearance lies one of the most haunting chapters of its long journey, the age of the forgotten pages. At first, the disappearance seemed almost accidental, a product of neglect rather than intent. The world had changed. Kingdoms that once looked to the prophecy for validation or comfort collapsed, their libraries abandoned, their scrolls scattered. Wars burned cities, and in the smoke of sieges, manuscripts crumbled into ash. Monasteries that had carefully copied and preserved lines of the prophecy were raided, their shelves emptied, their work lost in the fury of conquest. To the victors, such manuscripts were spoils of war. To the vanquished, they were fragile treasures swallowed by fire. And so, one by one, copies of the prophecy were destroyed, leaving only fragments, scraps, and whispers. Yet the disappearance was not only the result of war and fire. It was also the work of silence, deliberate, careful, calculated. For in certain ages the prophecy was deemed dangerous. Its words, too fluid and too powerful, threatened those who sought control. A ruler who feared the prophecy might command that it be suppressed, removed from sermons, stricken from records. Scholars who clung to its words might be discredited, their writings buried in archives never meant to be opened. A prophecy that once crowned kings could also unseat them, and in the hands of their enemies, its interpretations could become weapons. To neutralize that weapon, some chose to erase it. One can imagine the atmosphere of such suppression. Scribes instructed to turn their quills to other works, priests warned to preach safer texts, citizens told that the prophecy was nothing more. Then superstition. Libraries might quietly remove it from their shelves, sliding it into locked cabinets or sealed vaults where only the privileged might see. In some cases, it may even have been burned intentionally, sacrificed in rituals of control, where fire consumed not only parchment, but the collective memory it carried. For what is censorship but the attempt to erase memory itself? In these centuries, the prophecy became like a ghost. It lingered at the edges of awareness, but was never fully seen. People might have remembered hearing of it, but could not recall its words. Old commentaries referenced passages that no longer seemed to exist, as if the prophecy had retreated behind a veil. And in that absence, imagination filled the gaps. The more it disappeared, the more it became a shadow, an elusive presence whispered of but seldom encountered. The prophecy's silence was itself a kind of power, an emptiness that drew speculation, longing, and unease. There is a peculiar heaviness in such forgetting, a mournfulness that is not unlike grief. Entire generations grew up without the prophecy shaping their world. They did not sit around fires, hearing its words as tales. They did not see kings crowned with its echoes. They lived instead in a world emptied of that voice, and though they may not have known what was missing, the silence shaped them nonetheless. Imagine a town whose bell has cracked. The people adjust to the absence of its ringing, but in the stillness of each hour something feels incomplete. Such was the effect of the prophecy's disappearance. The silencing also had an intellectual weight. Scholars in later centuries would open manuscripts, expecting to find references, only to discover gaps where the prophecy should have been. Commentaries referred to lines that no longer survived, leaving tantalizing clues without substance. This created a haunting puzzle. What exactly had been lost? Was it merely a few words or entire volumes? Had the prophecy been larger, richer, more detailed than the fragments that endured? Each missing piece became a wound in the collective. Memory and the wound a source of unease. Sometimes traces emerged in unlikely places. A scribe might quote a line in the margin of a sermon, unaware that he was preserving a fragment others would one day seek. A traveler might carry the memory of a verse across mountains, passing it to strangers who wrote it down without knowing its origin. Such fragments were like embers, glowing faintly in the ashes, reminders that the fire had once burned brightly. But embers alone could not restore the flame, and for the most part, the prophecy remained buried in silence. There is mystery, too, in how disappearance deepens allure. For when something is hidden, it begins to shimmer in the imagination of those who seek it. Whispers of the prophecy's loss stirred curiosity. Why had it been buried? What secrets did it contain that rulers feared? The very absence of its words gave rise to new interpretations, speculations that perhaps the prophecy contained revelations too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Some claimed it foretold the end of empires still standing. Others believed it revealed cosmic truths that the unprepared world was not ready to hear. The prophecy, in disappearing, became larger than it had ever been when present. Its silence was more powerful than its voice. This period of forgetting also reveals something profound about humanity's relationship with memory. We imagine that what is written is safe, that words on parchment or stone will endure. Yet the prophecy reminds us of fragility. A single flame can consume centuries of preservation. A single command can silence voices once thought eternal. What survives is not always what is most important, but what chance or fate allows to endure. The prophecy, though forgotten, survived in fragments, and in those fragments lay the possibility of return. Still, for those who lived during its absence, the silence must have felt heavy, even oppressive. Without the prophecy, the world seemed unanchored, lacking the thread of destiny that had once tied past to future. People turned instead to other stories, other myths, other frameworks of meaning. Yet none carried quite the same resonance. The prophecy's disappearance left a void, and though the void was filled, the filling was never quite sufficient. There remained a lingering sense that something greater, something vast and ancient, had slipped away. In monasteries, a few monks kept copies hidden. Whether by devotion or by rebellion, they smuggled texts into secret chambers, storing them in boxes beneath altars or in the hollow walls of cloisters. Some carved the prophecy into wood, burying the tablets in fields, trusting that one day they would be found. Others encoded it into songs, disguising its verses as hymns, ensuring that even when the written word was gone, the melody might carry the memory forward. These were the keepers of silence, the guardians of forgotten pages, who ensured that disappearance was never total. Their work was quiet, secretive, and dangerous, but it preserved embers in the darkness. And so the prophecy passed through this mournful age, not entirely extinguished but submerged, hidden beneath centuries of dust and silence. Its disappearance was not final, but cyclical, like the waning of the moon before its return. Yet, the experience of loss changed the way it was later received. When at last it resurfaced, when fragments were rediscovered, when verses reappeared in libraries thought barren, it was greeted not merely as a text, but as a resurrection. Its absence gave it a sacred aura, as if the prophecy itself had chosen to vanish and then re-emerge. The forgotten pages thus became part of the prophecy's power. Their silence whispered alongside the words, reminding every reader that what they held was fragile, mortal, threatened always by the possibility of erasure. To open a manuscript and read its lines was to feel not only the presence of meaning, but the absence of what had been lost. The prophecy spoke in two voices, the voice of what remained and the ghostly voice of what was gone. In that haunting duality lies the mystery of its disappearance, for though it vanished, it never entirely left. Though it was silenced, it continued to whisper. Though it was destroyed, fragments endured, and in those fragments, centuries later, humanity would once again hear the echo of its forgotten pages and lean in, trembling, to listen. The prophecy had lain dormant for centuries, buried in forgotten libraries, whispered only by a few who dared to preserve its fragments, and ignored by a world that had moved on. Yet prophecies do not remain still forever. They are like seeds, buried deep within soil, awaiting the right season, the right conditions, the right light to awaken. And in the age we call the present, an age of speed, noise, and restless ambition, the cracks began to appear. At first they seemed like ordinary cracks, accidents of history, coincidences, mere patterns imagined by restless minds. But slowly, too slowly to be dismissed as random, the world began to shift in ways that stirred old lines back to life. It began quietly. A flood here, a fire there, a leader's sudden fall, a new invention unveiled with the promise to reshape all of society. None of these moments taken alone seemed extraordinary. The world has always known disaster, collapse, and innovation, but for those who remembered even fragments of the prophecy, a chill lingered. In candle-lit studies, in the margins of crumbling manuscripts, they found words that seemed to hum with familiarity when laid beside the headlines of modern papers. A phrase about waters rising where once there was none recalled sudden floods in cities never before threatened. A warning of the towers of man trembling echoed too clearly when buildings fell not by age, but by violence or earthquake. What had once been distant poetry began to feel like present truth. The unsettling thing was not any single event, but the rhythm. A rhythm of correspondence, of alignment. It was as though the world itself had begun to speak in the cadence of the prophecy, as if history were leaning toward a script written long before. Politicians rose with astonishing speed, only to crumble as if some invisible hand had tugged them down. Nations long stable found themselves trembling at the edges, fissures appearing in their once solid foundations. And through it all, the old. Words seemed to hum faintly in the background, whispering that none of this was new, that all had been foreseen. Technology, too, added its voice to the unease. Machines that once seemed the product of imagination alone were now woven into daily life. The prophecy had spoken, some said, of voices carried through the air, without flesh, without wings, yet touching every ear. In the age of satellites and wireless networks, the line felt less like metaphor and more like description. Another fragment told of men and women staring into polished stone, seeing one another across oceans. Was this not the mirror glow of our screens, the quiet tyranny of devices that lit up every room, every hand? Even skeptics began to pause, uncomfortable at the coincidences. It was one thing for a prophecy to speak vaguely, it was another for its whispers to align with inventions that had transformed the very fabric of existence. Natural disasters heightened the unease. Earthquakes shook regions long thought quiet. Hurricanes tore through coasts in patterns that mirrored strange, half-forgotten verses. The winds shall circle in fury, and the waters shall claim the land. Scientists spoke of climate cycles, of warming oceans, of tectonic inevitabilities. Yet to those who remembered the prophecy, the science did not cancel the words, it deepened them. For the prophecy had never denied natural explanation, it had only foretold that nature itself would rise, as if awakened by some greater tide. And then there were the faces, leaders, thinkers, rebels, visionaries, who seemed uncannily to fit descriptions written more than 1,000 years before. A line about the child of the East who rises with silver on his brow was seized upon when a prominent figure, known for his silver hair, began to dominate politics. Another passage spoke of a voice that unites the broken, yet carries the shadow of division, a description many applied to those who, in our age, gathered followers across nations through the sheer magnetism of speech, only to leave fractures in their wake. Whether truth or coincidence, the parallels unsettled. It was not that the prophecy described them exactly, but that it described them enough to cast doubt, enough to feel the breath of something uncanny. What deepened the unease further was the timing. The prophecy had long spoken of an age when the world shall be wrapped in light yet shrouded in shadow. To earlier centuries, the line had seemed abstract, but now, when cities glow with electric brilliance, when satellites encircle the earth, when every night is banished by neon and screen, the world is indeed wrapped in light. And yet, beneath the light, there is shadow, wars that do not end, crises that multiply, loneliness in crowded rooms. The contradiction of our age, brightness and darkness in the same moment, felt eerily foretold. Whispers began to stir. In quiet forums, in late-night conversations, people spoke of the prophecy again. Scholars unearthed fragments long dismissed, reassessing them under the lens of present events. Journalists hinted at it in veiled terms, unwilling to name it directly, but weaving its imagery into their reports. Even those who laughed at prophecy found themselves unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that history had begun to follow a script not of its own making. The sense was subtle, not overwhelming, but persistent. The ground beneath reality seemed to tilt, ever so slightly, as if nudging humanity toward a threshold. Yet what frightened most was not the clarity, but the vagueness. The prophecy never gave names, never offered dates, never marked locations with certainty. It spoke in images, in metaphors, in poetry. This left room for doubt, for skepticism. But it also left room for fear. For if the cracks appearing in the present were only the beginning, what lay beyond them? If these were merely the first alignments, what awaited in the full unfolding? The uncertainty was itself a haunting. Humanity, for all its science and certainty, found itself once again leaning toward whispers in the dark. And so the present moment became charged. Every earthquake felt like an omen, every invention a confirmation, every fall of a leader an echo. Some dismissed it as paranoia, as the ancient human habit of finding patterns where none existed. Yet others argued that dismissing it was itself blindness, a refusal to see that something larger was unfolding. The prophecy, long forgotten, was returning not with a shout but with a whisper, not with certainty but with unease. The cracks in the present were not yet wide, but they were widening. And in the widening, something stirred. Perhaps the most unsettling realization was this: the prophecy did not need to be true in a literal sense to shape reality. The belief itself, the whisper that this was foretold, was enough to alter the course of events. Leaders, hearing that their rise or fall was written centuries ago, began to act as though it were inevitable. Citizens, frightened by natural disasters framed as omens, shifted their choices, their loyalties, their hopes. Technology, seen through the lens of ancient lines, carried not only convenience, but dread. In this way, the prophecy began to work not as prediction, but as influence. Not as map, but as magnet. It shaped the present simply by being remembered. And so we stand in a world where the cracks continue to widen. The signs are ordinary, yet they gather into something extraordinary. They are subtle, yet they resonate. They are whispers, yet they grow louder. The prophecy is not shouted from rooftops, not carved into stone for all to see. It moves instead. In quiet correspondences, in eerie alignments, in the unsettled sense that the world itself is leaning, bending, tilting towards something long foretold. We are not yet at the threshold, but the door is near. The cracks are there, and through them the prophecy breathes again. There are moments when the weight of centuries folds in on itself, when words once inked on fading parchment or murmured in candle-lit temples rise with terrifying clarity against the backdrop of our own world. For generations, the prophecy had been treated as an echo, a murmur of the past, something to be studied or dismissed. But now, with the cracks already widening, the words themselves return. Not vague, not distant, but sharp, precise, unsettlingly familiar. They do not come as whispers this time, but as mirrors reflecting our present with a clarity that chills. The first passage appears simple, almost poetic in its phrasing. When fire shall fall upon towers made by man's pride, the smoke shall cloud the eyes of nations, and their hearts shall tremble. For centuries, scholars debated what this meant. Some saw it as metaphor, an allegory for the collapse of empires, the downfall of kings. But in the modern era, when towers of steel and glass collapsed into clouds of ash, choking city streets and broadcasting terror across the globe, the verse read no longer as allegory but as description. The alignment was so uncanny that even skeptics paused. Could words from over a millennium ago so precisely capture the images that now loop endlessly across screens? The smoke, the terror, the trembling hearts of nations. Another fragment, nearly as haunting, had long been overlooked. The seas shall swallow the edges of the earth, and places once dry shall sink while others drown in rains unceasing. Medieval scribes thought it fanciful, a poetic flourish about floods of sin. But as modern coastlines erode, as storms grow more violent, as cities wrestle with waters pushing beyond their barriers, the line takes on a new urgency. The phrase "rains unceasing" calls to mind news footage of streets turned to rivers, cars swept away, families stranded on rooftops. The prophecy does not name the cause, whether wrath or climate, but the image aligns too closely with what our own eyes witness. Perhaps most unsettling is a verse once dismissed as incomprehensible. Men shall carry voices in their hands, and through shining stones they shall see one another, though parted by oceans. Yet in their multitude of speech they shall know silence, for hearts shall grow cold. When first written, the idea of voices carried in the hand seemed absurd, but in the modern glow of smartphones, when polished screens reflect faces across continents, the words strike like a knife. More chilling still is the second half, that in all this speaking silence would grow. For we live in an age of constant connection, yet never before has loneliness been so widespread. The prophecy does not merely predict the device, it predicts its consequence, the strange paradox of endless voices and empty hearts. Then there is the passage that seems to breathe the air of our politics. A voice shall rise that binds the broken with honeyed words, yet beneath its tongue lies the seed of division. The people shall cheer, yet their unity shall fray as cloth, torn by unseen hands. Through centuries, the verse was applied again and again to different leaders, each generation convinced it had found the match. But today, when charismatic figures gather crowds through speeches and streams, uniting some while dividing many, the words land with terrifying weight. They do not accuse any one person, but describe a pattern that feels eerily alive in our age, the cycle of voices that inspire even as they fracture. The prophecy also speaks of machines, though in language that once baffled its readers. Engines without beast shall move swifter than the falcon, carrying men in iron bellies across the heavens. Yet in their swiftness lies the seed of sorrow, for the sky shall rain fire. To earlier eyes, the verse was a riddle, fanciful imagery of dragons or celestial chariots. But in the roar of airplanes, in the shadow of jets streaking across skies, the verse is plain. Worse still, when planes fall or are turned to weapons, the sky raining fire ceases to be metaphor and becomes a line of devastating precision. And still the words continue, uncanny in their reach. When the world is wrapped in light, shadow shall grow deepest. The nights shall vanish from cities, but men shall stumble as though blind. The modern world, drenched in electric glow, cities blazing with neon and screens, is a world wrapped in light. And yet the sense of shadow, the unrest, the wars, the despair has not lessened. If anything, it has deepened. It is as if the prophecy saw not only the technological triumph of illumination, but the paradox of a world that, in banishing night, birthed a darker night of the soul. What chills most, however, is not the external events, but the inward ones. A little-known verse buried deep in one of the oldest fragments speaks of the human heart itself, The people shall hunger in the midst of plenty, and thirst though rivers flow, for they shall seek not bread nor water but meaning and find it not. To an earlier world this line puzzled. How could hunger exist in plenty? But today, in an age of abundance and distraction, when shelves are full yet many feel starved of purpose, the words cut deeply. They name a wound of the present, one not visible in the news but palpable in the soul. It is at this point that the tone shifts from uncanny to terrifying. For as the verses align with the present, the prophecy begins to extend forward, suggesting not only description, but direction. The cracks shall widen until the ground itself groans. The people shall cry out for answers, but the voices they follow shall lead them to crossroads of fire. The phrase, crossroads of fire, has no clear modern referent, yet in a world teetering on the edge of conflict, with weapons capable of global devastation, the metaphor feels uncomfortably literal. The idea that the prophecy not only names what has already occurred, but foreshadows what lies ahead, lends it an unbearable gravity. The cinematic quality of these verses cannot be overstated. One can almost imagine the words laid over present-day footage. Skyscrapers cloaked in smoke as the line about towers echoes, flooded streets paired with the verse about seas swallowing the earth, glowing screens flickering against the prophecy of shining stones. The effect is chilling because it collapses the barrier between past and present. It is not simply that history repeats itself, but that history appears to have been spoken long before it happened. The prophecy is no longer a relic. It is a mirror, word for word, line for line, reflecting the headlines of our times. And yet in this mirror there is no comfort. For what does it mean if the prophecy is true? Does it mean the future is fixed, that humanity is bound to a script written centuries ago? Or does it mean the prophecy, in being believed, shapes the very events it foretells? This is the deeper terror, the possibility that by seeing ourselves, in its words, we are unwittingly fulfilling them, that in treating the prophecy as mirror, we turn it into map. The world now stands in uneasy silence. Scholars pore over every line, journalists draw cautious parallels, ordinary people whisper of omens. Some argue that the words are vague enough to fit anything, that humans are skilled at pattern-making. But even the skeptics cannot deny the emotional power of seeing ancient lines aligned so closely with modern life. It is not about proof. It is about recognition. The shock of looking into a mirror and finding that the face staring back is not entirely your own, but something older, stranger, more inevitable. Thus we come to the chilling truth of this section. The prophecy has stepped out of the past and into the present, word for word. It no longer whispers, it declares. It overlays itself onto our time like a shadow perfectly aligned with the body. That casts it. And as we read the verses, as we feel their weight against our own reality, we cannot escape the sensation that we are no longer simply living history, we are inhabiting prophecy. The mirror has been lifted, and in it, we see not only who we are but what may yet come. It is one thing to feel the chill of recognition when ancient words seem to echo modern events. It is another to accept without hesitation that prophecy has spoken across time with unbroken accuracy. Where awe stirs, doubt follows. Where some see destiny, others see patterns made by restless minds. The story of the prophecy, like all stories that stretch across centuries, is not only one of belief, but of resistance to belief. And so, woven alongside the reverent voices that treat the words as sacred, there are those who whisper more cautiously, who lean into the light of reason as if holding back the darkness of superstition. The skeptics are not villains in this narrative. They are historians, linguists, scientists, philosophers, people whose vocation has been to look closely, to question, to insist that the extraordinary must prove itself. To them, the prophecy is not a miracle but a puzzle, one that yields natural explanations when examined carefully. They stand in shadowed libraries and bright lecture halls, drawing on fragments of parchment, shifting translations, and the long record of human imagination. Their tone is calm, even respectful, but firm. For them, mystery is not dissolved by reverence, but by scrutiny. The first argument is one of coincidence. Human history, they say, is filled with wars, floods, leaders, and collapses. A prophecy that speaks in broad strokes, of towers falling, of seas rising, of voices rising to deceive, can always be matched to some event if one looks hard enough. What seems uncanny is, to their eyes, simply inevitable. Towers fall not because prophecy declared it, but because human beings build high and time or conflict pulls them down. Floods rise not because of divine foresight, but because the earth has always shifted and storms have always come. To see these things in ancient words is not evidence of prediction, but of our desire to find ourselves reflected in the past. Then comes the argument of language. Few realize how fragile the texts are, how many times they have been copied, translated, mistranslated, and glossed by scribes across generations. A single word in the original tongue may have multiple meanings. Fire might mean passion, sea might mean chaos, voice might mean rumor. When modern interpreters select one meaning over another, they tilt the prophecy toward their own era. What was once a metaphor for spiritual unrest becomes a description of climate disaster. What once meant rumor becomes smartphones and social media. To the skeptical scholar, this is not foresight, but projection, our age casting its anxieties backward onto an old and ambiguous text. Others focus on psychology. The human mind, they remind us, is wired to see patterns even where none exist. This tendency, called apophenia, is not new. It is why we see faces in clouds or meaning in random numbers. When confronted with the sprawling and often chaotic verses of prophecy, people naturally gravitate toward the lines that match what they already know. Out of dozens of vague predictions, they highlight the 2 or 3 that seem accurate. The rest, the ones that failed or never came true, fade conveniently into obscurity. This is the selective vision of belief, not the precision of truth. There are too the historians who insist that prophecy is best understood not as prediction, but as commentary. When the text first appeared, it spoke to the fears and hopes of its own time. If it described towers, it may have meant the temples of that century. If it spoke of seas rising, it may have meant foreign invaders arriving by ship. The prophecy in this reading is not timeless, but time-bound, a poetic reflection of the age in which it was born. That modern readers find relevance in it says less about its foresight and more about the universality of human concerns. Every age has its towers, its storms, its charismatic leaders, its hungers. The prophecy, then, is a mirror not of the future, but of humanity itself. One of the most pointed criticisms comes from textual critics, those who spend their lives dissecting manuscripts. They note how often texts were edited by later scribes, shaped by political or religious agendas. It is entirely possible, they argue, that passages we now treat as ancient were inserted much later, adjusted to fit events already known. What appears to be prediction may, in truth, be revision, history disguised as foresight. Without unbroken manuscripts stretching back to the origin, how can one ever be certain that the words we now read were the words once spoken? The skeptics are also aware of how belief itself can generate fulfillment. A community that believes disaster is coming may unconsciously act in ways that bring it about. A ruler who believes he is the figure foretold may pursue policies that fracture rather than unite. In this sense, prophecy is not prediction but catalyst, shaping reality not by foresight but by influence. The skeptics warn that to treat the prophecy as inevitable is to risk surrendering agency. It is not destiny that fulfills the words, it is people believing in destiny. Yet for all their calm analysis, the skeptics cannot erase the unease. They too feel the shiver when the words are read aloud. They too notice the eerie parallels, even as they explain them away. One historian admitted in a private letter later found among his papers that while he could account for every passage by natural means, he still found himself restless at night, the images lingering in his mind, like smoke. This is the paradox of doubt. It shields against belief, but it does not always soothe. Sometimes, in denying the prophecy's power, skeptics find themselves haunted all the more by its shadow. Indeed, the very persistence of skepticism becomes part of the prophecy's mystery. For the text itself, in one rarely cited passage, warns, "Some shall hear and dismiss, saying it is nothing but dust and wind. Yet their words too shall be folded into the scroll, for even disbelief is part of the design." Believers seize upon this line as proof that denial was itself foretold, that the skeptic's very resistance only confirms the prophecy's reach. Skeptics, of course, call this a clever trick, an ancient writer hedging his bets by predicting both belief and disbelief. Still, the interplay deepens the atmosphere. Even doubt cannot escape the prophecy's net. The debates are endless. In candlelit seminar rooms, in radio broadcasts, in online forums, the prophecy is dissected from every angle. Some argue about etymology, tracing root words through dead languages. Others plot historical parallels, showing how every age has claimed the prophecy for itself. Still others run statistical analyses, trying to measure whether the accuracy exceeds what chance would allow. The conclusions vary, but the discussions themselves keep the prophecy alive. The skeptics, in trying to disarm it, ensure its continued relevance. This tension between belief and doubt creates a peculiar balance. If everyone believed without question, the prophecy would harden into dogma, and its mystery would vanish. If everyone doubted, it would crumble into obscurity. But because both belief and doubt persist, because reverent voices and skeptical ones echo side by side, the prophecy remains suspended in twilight, neither fully proven nor fully dismissed. It is this twilight that gives it power. The skeptics, for all their resistance, are part of the story's fabric. They are the shadows that define the light, the questioners who sharpen the ore. In a way, their presence ensures that the prophecy never collapses into certainty. It remains a living tension, a riddle that endures precisely because it is never solved. To walk among the skeptics is to step into a quieter chamber of the mystery, one lit not by fire but by the glow of reason, where voices speak in calm tones, weighing, balancing, doubting. And yet, even here, in the careful syllables of scholars, the night is never entirely banished. There is always the faint sound of the prophecy itself, echoing just beyond the edge of explanation. Thus, Section 8 leaves us not with answers, but with equilibrium. The prophecy stands not as proven destiny, nor as dismissed fraud, but as something stranger, a thread stretched taut between belief and doubt, shimmering in the dark. And whether one leans toward faith or skepticism, the words remain steady and unbroken, waiting for the next age to read them anew. There comes a moment in every study of prophecy when the question cannot be avoided. Are these words to be taken as metaphor or as literal prediction? It is a question as old as prophecy itself, for human beings have always wrestled with the language of mystery. A storm described in verse. Was it the fury of heaven or merely a political upheaval? A beast rising from the sea. Was it a kingdom or was it an actual creature? The prophecy that threads its way through our story is no exception. If it is mere symbol, then it is a mirror, reflecting the fears, desires, and imagination of its readers. But if it is literal, if every image is a precise reflection of events yet to come, then the implications are almost unbearable. To peel apart this question is to step into a chamber where certainty crumbles and only echoes remain. The opening lines of the prophecy provide the clearest case for dual meaning. They speak of a fire without flame, rising from stone towers, casting shadows over the earth. To the symbolic interpreter, this is the language of upheaval. Towers representing power, fire without flame representing chaos or revolution, shadows representing fear spreading among peoples. It is an image fit for any century, from the collapse of ancient empires to modern wars. But to the literal interpreter, the description is chilling. Fire without flame could easily describe explosions or even nuclear blasts. Stone towers falling could be skyscrapers struck down by disaster, shadows covering the earth, mushroom clouds, or the dust of ruin. One reader shrugs and calls it metaphor, another shudders and whispers of prophecy fulfilled. This duality threads through every passage. When the text declares that the seas shall rise higher than the mountains, is this a metaphor for nations in turmoil, an allegory of empires swelling beyond their borders? Or is it literal, The oceans themselves swallowing land, a warning of climate catastrophe centuries before science gave it a name. The ambiguity is deliberate, skeptics argue. Poets have always written in images. To demand literal meaning is to misunderstand the genre. And yet believers counter, if the seas do rise and if lands do drown, how could we deny that the prophecy spoke with terrifying precision? Perhaps the most haunting section is one in which the prophecy speaks of a voice carried in every ear, speaking with many tongues at once yet understood by all. Metaphorically, this could be read as the spread of ideologies, religions, or philosophies, each voice echoing across cultures, reshaping hearts. But literally, how can one not think of modern technology? Radio, television, the internet, the smartphone. Voices now do speak into every ear in many languages, reaching all at once. Did the ancient seer glimpse our age in fiery vision, or did he simply describe the perennial human fear of influence and manipulation? The line trembles between poetry and foresight, refusing to settle on one side. Some scholars propose that this tension is itself the design. A prophecy that is too clear, too literal, can be disproven the moment reality veers in another direction. But a prophecy woven in metaphor cannot be destroyed so easily. Its symbols flex and shift with each generation, adapting to new contexts. In this view, the ambiguity is not a flaw, but a shield. It is what allows the prophecy to survive centuries, to remain relevant whether it is read in the candlelit chambers of monks or the glowing screens of modern readers. Yet this theory raises another question. If the prophecy was designed to be unreadable, does that mean it is merely artifice, a clever riddle meant to endure? Or does it mean its truth is hidden, accessible only to those with the insight to pierce the veil? There are traditions that lean heavily towards symbolism. Mystics in the medieval era treated prophecy not as history in advance, but as spiritual instruction. Every beast was not a literal monster, but a vice. Every storm was not a hurricane, but a crisis of the soul. To them, the prophecy was a guidebook for inner transformation, not a timetable for world events. They whispered that only fools waited for towers to fall or seas to rise. The wise instead searched for the towers of pride within themselves, the floods of greed, the shadows of fear. To such interpreters, the prophecy was never about the world outside, but about the hidden world within. And yet, the literalists remain equally persuasive. For scattered through the text are phrases that seem impossibly precise. In one passage, it speaks of iron birds striking from the heavens and cities crumbling to dust in their wake. Symbolists call this a metaphor for warlike empires or for the speed of fate. But in the age of airplanes and bombings, how can one not see a literal warning? To dismiss it as coincidence seems almost willful. And so the debate rages. Did the seer truly envision machines of war centuries before their invention, or do we twist the words to fit our reality? Part of the difficulty lies in the nature of ancient languages. A single term might carry meanings that do not exist in modern speech. The word we translate as bird may have also meant messenger, omen, or spirit. Fire might mean destruction, energy, or even divine presence. If the prophecy says iron bird, are we right to picture airplanes, or have we mistranslated an ancient metaphor that meant something entirely different? In this sense, the prophecy may be both literal and symbolic at once, its meanings layered, unfolding differently depending on the age and the reader. The possibility of a hidden code only deepens the mystery. Some claim that beneath the plain text lies a cipher, a pattern of letters or numbers designed to reveal specific truths. By counting characters, skipping lines, or tracing acrostics, hidden words emerge, names of places, years, disasters. Entire movements have sprung from such decoding, with believers poring over manuscripts like detectives, certain that the future lies concealed in the spacing of words. Critics dismiss this as confirmation bias, seeing order where none exists. But the very act of searching suggests that readers feel the prophecy resists being read plainly, that its truth must be concealed, wrapped in mystery like a pearl in its shell. The psychological weight of this debate cannot be understated. 2. View the prophecy as symbolic is to find safety. If towers fall only within, if seas rise only in metaphor, then the world need not fear annihilation. But to see the words as literal is to live beneath a shadow, always awaiting the next fulfillment, the next disaster foretold. For some, this tension creates obsession, a life spent trying to decide which side is true. For others, it creates paralysis, an inability to act because all outcomes seem already written. And for still others, it creates faith. Whether symbolic or literal, the prophecy is a voice from beyond, guiding humanity in ways not easily dismissed. What makes the matter more unsettling is how often reality blurs the line. A prophecy speaks of famine, a literal famine arrives. Was it foresight or coincidence? How prophecy speaks of leaders crowned in smoke and thunder. Years later, nations enthrone dictators whose reigns end in violence. Were the words metaphor for tyranny or exact glimpses of future men? The ambiguity does not dissolve with events, it deepens. Each fulfillment makes the prophecy feel literal, yet each alternate reading leaves it open to doubt. And so, generation after generation, readers stand at the same fork in the road. Some walk the path of symbol, seeing wisdom in metaphor. Others walk the path of literalism, bracing for fulfillment. And some remain in the crossroads, acknowledging that they cannot choose, that the prophecy may be both, poetry that shapes reality, imagery that becomes literal through the very act of belief. After all, if enough people believe a symbolic, warning to be literal, they may act in ways that bring it true. In this paradox, the prophecy is both metaphor and reality, both code and prediction. The suspense lies in never knowing which side will be proven right. Even today, as events unfold, the debate continues. Rising seas tempt the literalists. Political upheaval gives voice to the symbolists. Technology that places voices in every sphere tempts both sides. And still the prophecy waits, silent but alive, refusing to collapse into one meaning. Its hidden code may never be broken, or perhaps it already has, each interpreter believing they alone have glimpsed its truth. And so we leave this section not with resolution, but with unease. The prophecy does not yield to simple categories. It is not fully symbolic, nor fully literal. It is not wholly safe, nor wholly terrifying. It lingers between, like twilight. Both, night and day, both shadow and flame. To read it is to dwell in uncertainty, to feel the pull of two worlds at once, one where symbols whisper wisdom, and one where words blaze into reality. The prophecy remains a hidden code, inviting, daring, warning, and above all, refusing to be solved. When one studies a single prophecy, it feels like a solitary flame, fragile yet defiant in the dark. But when that flame is compared with others from different lands and different centuries, something startling begins to take shape. The realization that humanity has carried similar visions across civilizations. From desert tribes to mountain hermits, from imperial courts to village firesides, echoes of the same themes appear. This is not to say the words are identical, rather the patterns, images and warnings interlace into what feels like a cosmic web of destiny. Our prophecy is no longer a solitary thread, but part of a larger tapestry, woven across continents, ages and languages, binding the human imagination to something far greater than itself. Let us begin in the East, where Chinese traditions carry the Tui Bei Tu, a prophetic text composed during the Tang dynasty. Its verses are filled with cryptic illustrations depicting emperors, wars, invasions, and upheavals in riddling couplets. For centuries, scholars believed that these verses contained the blueprint of China's dynastic cycles. Yet if one steps back and reads without the framework of Chinese history, one finds familiar images: a dragon in turmoil, a mandate falling from heaven, fire rising without smoke, waters drowning the plains. It is uncanny how many of these metaphors match those in our central prophecy. Was it coincidence, or did human minds in distant places reach toward the same archetypes, the same warnings whispered by fate? Journey westward, and the Persian tradition speaks with equal weight. The Zandi Vohuman Yasht, part of the Zoroastrian corpus, presents a vision of a world declining through successive ages. In its imagery, Each age grows shorter, more troubled, more violent, until at last chaos overwhelms the order of creation. Here too one finds the motifs of fire, floods, and the rise of dark rulers. The prophecy climaxes in the arrival of a savior figure, a Saoshyant, who will cleanse the world in fire and renew it. Again, the echoes are undeniable. Fire not merely as destruction, but as purification. The end not merely as collapse, but as transformation. Compare this with the passages we have already explored, and the resonance deepens. Is humanity's collective imagination wired to conjure fire and flood as the great punctuation marks of history? Or is there truly a shared destiny, glimpsed by different seers beneath different skies? The Hebrew scriptures offer another mirror. In the apocalyptic visions of Daniel and Ezekiel, beasts rise from the sea, horns sprout from their heads, kings fall, and kingdoms are weighed and found wanting. The book of Revelation, written centuries later, multiplies these images into a dizzying cascade of fire, trumpets, seals, and bowls. Whether one reads these texts literally or symbolically, the pattern is the same. History marches toward a great crisis, a convulsion in which human pride is shattered and divine judgment falls. The parallel with our central prophecy is difficult to ignore. The same images, the sea, the beast, the fire, the collapse of towers, return again and again in slightly different garments, but carrying the same essence. Among the peoples of the Americas, prophecies also breathe with similar tones. The Hopi of the Southwest speak of the blue star Kachina, a sign in the heavens that will herald the purification of the earth. Their oral traditions describe cycles of worlds destroyed and remade, one by fire, one by ice, one by flood, and speak of a coming age when greed and war will be cleansed. To read their prophecies alongside those from the East is to feel an uncanny kinship. No written manuscripts connected these peoples with those of Asia or the Middle East, yet the motifs align: fire, water, stars falling, cycles of destruction and renewal, echoes upon echoes, as if humanity itself cannot help but dream in the same language when it dreams of the end. Consider too the Norse traditions of Ragnarok. Here, the gods themselves are doomed, the world torn apart in a cataclysm of fire and flood, the sky split, the serpent rising from the sea, and the sun swallowed in darkness. Yet, after the devastation, a green earth rises again and life begins anew. The resonance with other world traditions is overwhelming. In ancient Scandinavia, where snow and sea-shaped existence, the prophecy still carried the same universal cadence: destruction, fire, flood, renewal. The Norsemen did not know the Zoroastrians, nor the Hopi, nor the compilers of the Hebrew Bible. Yet their seers dreamed the same dreams. Travel farther south to the Mayan civilization, and the cycles of the long count calendar whisper similar themes. The Maya envisioned epochs of creation, each destroyed and replaced by the next. To them, history was not linear but cyclical, each world burning out like a candle only for another to be lit. The much misunderstood 2012 prophecy was but one layer of this worldview, where an age ends not in absolute annihilation, but in transformation. A turning of the cosmic wheel. Once more we find correspondence with our own central prophecy, which hints not only at doom, but also at a shift, a birth beyond the destruction. Even in tribal traditions scattered across Africa, similar motifs arise. The Dogon of Mali tell of the Nommo, beings from the stars, who once descended and who will return. Their myths are layered with astronomical details that baffle scholars. Knowledge of Sirius's binary star system long before modern astronomy confirmed it. Woven into their tales is a sense of cycles, of endings and renewals, of warnings carried from beyond. Is it metaphor, myth, or prophecy? Whatever the answer, the themes echo the larger web: a warning, a destruction, a renewal. The Celtic Druids, too, whispered of cycles. Though much of their lore was lost under Roman conquest and Christianization, fragments suggest they believed in ages of the world, turning like seasons. There were prophecies of a great darkness that would sweep the Isles, followed by the return of light. Later Irish texts like the Lebor Gabála Erin, the Book of Invasions, preserve mythic histories where peoples rise, fall, and are consumed by cataclysm, only for new peoples to take their place. Once more, the pattern repeats. Is this convergence, coincidence, or is it evidence of something deeper, an archetypal truth buried in the human psyche, or perhaps a shared message whispered into different ears across time? Skeptics argue that human beings everywhere live with the same elemental forces: fire, water, storm, famine. It is natural that they would imagine endings in terms of these forces. Yet believers counter that the convergence goes beyond mere imagery. It is the sequence, the rhythm: pride, fall, fire, flood, renewal. The similarity lies not only in what is said, but in how it is said, as if the world itself has one heartbeat heard differently in every land. One cannot ignore the possibility of transmission. Trade routes carried not only silk and spices, but also stories, myths, and warnings. The Silk Road linked east and west, and the ocean currents brought Polynesian seafarers into contact with distant islands. Ideas travel. Prophecies may have blended, adapted, evolved as they moved, yet the sheer scope of the parallels, cultures with no contact at all, telling of the same fire and flood, suggests something beyond simple borrowing. It feels as though prophecy arises spontaneously, like springs from the earth, independent, yet connected by an underground river we cannot see. In our present age, when the world is connected as never before, the echoes grow louder. We can place the Hopi beside the Norse, the Maya beside the Persians, and trace the same pattern across oceans and centuries. The effect is dizzying, almost cosmic, as if humanity has been composing a symphony without knowing it, each culture adding its own instrument, yet all playing the same melody. That melody hums beneath our central prophecy, making it part of a global chorus rather than a solitary voice. The psychological effect of this realization is profound. To believe in one prophecy is to wrestle with doubt, but to see its themes echoed in a dozen others is to feel the floor tilt beneath one's feet. Either humanity is unimaginably consistent in inventing the same visions, or these visions are drawn from a shared source, a well of truth that seeps into different cultures in different ways. To sit with this thought is to feel oneself standing, not in the narrow corridor of one tradition, but in a vast hall of mirrors, each reflecting the same light from a slightly different angle. And what is that light? Is it a literal foresight of events that will one day unfold? Or is it the voice of the collective unconscious, the deep mind of humanity, whispering its fears and hopes in symbolic form? Perhaps both. Perhaps prophecy is a bridge between symbol and reality, where imagination and fate entwine. If so, then the echoes across civilizations are not accidents but confirmations, signals that humanity has always been listening to the same cosmic frequency, whether from desert, forest, mountain, or shore. Thus our prophecy stands not alone, but woven into this great fabric. Its flames, its shadows, its towers, its floods, they are not isolated visions but parts of a grander design. And as we draw these threads together, the tone shifts from the intimate to the cosmic. We are no longer reading the words of a single seer, but listening to the heartbeat of humanity itself, pulsing across centuries, across continents, across civilizations. The web stretches wider than we can see, and in its strands glimmers both terror and hope. For if the prophecies agree that endings must come, they also agree that renewals follow, that out of fire comes purity, out of flood comes new life, out of collapse comes dawn. In this realization lies both awe and dread. For the pattern that emerges is not one of chance, but of design. Whether written by the hand of destiny, the unconscious of mankind, or the whispers of something beyond, the prophecies across civilizations sing in harmony. And to listen to them together is to step out of history and into the vastness of mystery itself. When we step back from the thunder of predictions and the imagery of fire, flood, and shadow, we find ourselves left with a quieter question. Why do we, as human beings, cling so tightly to prophecy? Why do texts, sometimes hundreds or thousands, of years old, still echo in our imaginations? Why do we return to them generation after generation, as if within their words we might find a key to our own time? The endurance of prophecy cannot be explained only by the accuracy of its predictions, for many have been vague, misinterpreted, or simply wrong. Instead, the endurance lies in something deeper, something woven into the human heart, a psychological and emotional need that makes prophecy less about predicting the future and more about understanding ourselves. At its most basic level, prophecy is a response to uncertainty. Life is fragile and history is unpredictable. From the perspective of a villager centuries ago, living at the mercy of droughts, floods, invasions, and plague, the world was not a stable place. Even today, despite technology and global networks, we feel the same undercurrent of vulnerability. The earth quakes, the climate shifts, wars break out, economies collapse, and suddenly the ground beneath us feels as uncertain as it must have to our ancestors. Prophecy endures because it gives shape to that uncertainty. It transforms random chaos into a narrative, something the human mind can hold. Instead of nameless dread, prophecy offers an explanation. These events were foreseen, part of a greater pattern. Psychologists often speak of the human mind as a pattern-seeking engine. Our survival once depended on noticing the rustle of grass that might signal a predator, or the shift in clouds that might warn of a storm. Even in modern times, we continue to search for patterns, weaving them from numbers, symbols, or coincidences. Prophecy feeds this impulse perfectly. It provides a story, a thread, linking past, present, and future. We look at the cryptic words of a prophet and see our own times reflected there like constellations in the sky. The stars themselves are scattered randomly, but the human mind connects them into bears, hunters, and serpents. Prophecy functions in much the same way. Scattered words become meaningful patterns when illuminated by our imagination, but there is more than pattern-seeking at play. Prophecy also addresses the deepest fears of human existence, the fear of mortality and the fear of meaninglessness. Each of us knows, consciously or not, that our lives will one day end. Entire civilizations, too, carry the haunting awareness that they will not last forever. Prophecies of destruction give voice to this unspoken dread. They remind us of what we already sense, that nothing endures unchanged. Yet they also soothe that fear by promising renewal. Rarely does a prophecy end in silence. Instead, it speaks of transformation, a new dawn, a purified world, a savior who arrives at the final hour. In this way, prophecy reflects our own longing, to believe that even when everything we know ends, something greater will follow. It gives mortality a frame of meaning, making death not an abyss, but a passage. Prophecy also endures because it offers a sense of control in the uncontrollable. If disaster is random, then we are powerless before it. But if disaster is prophesied, then it becomes part of a plan. The difference may be subtle, but psychologically it is profound. To believe that a great war, famine, or flood was foreseen is to believe that the universe is not ruled by chance, but by design. And if there is design, perhaps there is also purpose. Prophecy reassures us that suffering is not meaningless, that it fits within a larger arc. This comfort has been sought by people in every age, from ancient farmers to modern readers scanning cryptic verses online. There is also the allure of exclusivity. To study prophecy is to feel that one is peering behind the curtain of history, glimpsing secrets hidden from others. Human beings have always cherished the idea of secret knowledge, mysteries that only the initiated can decode. Prophecy provides exactly that. Its words are rarely straightforward. They require interpretation, imagination, and often a sense of belonging to a select group that understands. Whether it is a medieval monk poring over Latin manuscripts, a 19th century mystic aligning stars with scripture, or a modern internet forum debating obscure predictions, the dynamic is the same. Prophecy makes us feel not just informed but chosen. Yet prophecy does not only appeal to fear and exclusivity, it also resonates with hope. For every image of destruction, there is often a promise of salvation. People cling to prophecy not only because it warns of darkness, but because it hints at light. The messianic figure, the golden age, the renewal of the earth, these are not mere add-ons but central elements of prophecy's power. They speak to our longing for justice, for wrongs to be righted, for suffering to be redeemed. In this sense, Prophecy is not only about predicting the end of the world, but about affirming that the world's story bends toward meaning. It keeps alive the hope that, despite all appearances, there is a better horizon waiting beyond the storm. This duality, fear and hope intertwined, explains why prophecy has such emotional staying power. It does not merely terrify, it consoles. It does not merely warn, it promises. In its shadow we find both our nightmares and our dreams, balanced in equal measure. That is why people return to prophecy in times of crisis. Wars, plagues, political upheavals. Whenever society trembles, prophecies resurface, quoted and reinterpreted anew. They give voice to our collective anxiety, but also remind us that chaos is not the end of the story. Another layer to prophecy's endurance lies in its adaptability. Prophetic texts are often vague, poetic, and symbolic, qualities that allow them to be reinterpreted again and again. A single passage can mean one thing to a medieval crusader, another to a Renaissance astrologer, and yet another to a modern reader scanning for signs in world news. This flexibility ensures that prophecy never dies. It evolves, reshaping itself, to fit each new era. In this sense, prophecy is not fixed but living, carried forward by human imagination. It is less like a rigid prediction and more like a mirror, reflecting back whatever each generation most fears or desires. Here lies one of the most fascinating psychological truths about prophecy. When people see their own time in a prophecy, they are also revealing something about themselves. What we emphasize in a prophetic text says more about our own anxieties than about the prophet's original intent. A verse about fire from the skies may once have conjured lightning or meteors, but in the nuclear age it evokes missiles and mushroom clouds. The words themselves do not change, but our reading of them does. Prophecy endures because it is endlessly flexible, always ready to absorb the symbols of the moment. This reflective quality makes prophecy almost therapeutic. By projecting our fears and hopes onto ancient words, we give them form and narrative. Instead of being vague and formless, our anxieties become part of a story. In psychology, this is known as externalization, making inner turmoil visible, where it can be examined and processed. Prophecy provides that externalization on a cultural scale. It allows societies to articulate their deepest worries without naming them directly. A prophecy about beasts rising from the sea may really be about fear of invasion. A prophecy about famine may reflect anxiety over harvests or economic collapse. The words endure because the emotions behind them are universal and timeless. But prophecy also taps into another deep longing, the need to belong to something greater than oneself. Human beings across cultures and ages crave connection not only to their immediate community, but also to the grand sweep of history. Prophecy satisfies this by linking personal existence to cosmic drama. To believe that one lives in the end times is to believe that one's life, however ordinary, is part of the greatest story ever told. It lifts the weight of insignificance. In this way, prophecy is not merely about the future, but about identity. It tells us who we are in relation to the universe. The endurance of prophecy is also tied to its artistry. Prophets rarely wrote in dry, straightforward prose. They used poetry, metaphor, rhythm, and symbol. Their words are filled with beasts, stars, trumpets, flames, rivers, and thrones, images that stir the imagination. Poetry lodges in the memory far more deeply than plain speech. A cryptic image can be remembered for centuries, whispered from mouth to mouth, long after more practical words are forgotten. In this sense, prophecy survives not only because of what it says, but because of how it says it. Its artistry gives it wings. We must also consider the role of community. Prophecies do not endure in isolation. They endure because communities preserve them, interpret them, and pass them on. A text becomes sacred because people gather around it, retell it, and invest it with meaning. Prophecy is not merely a message, it is a social bond. It gathers people into circles of expectation and interpretation. Whether in ancient temples, medieval monasteries, or online forums, prophecy creates community. And communities give it life across generations. Finally, prophecy endures because it allows us to face the unknowable with dignity. The future is, by definition, inaccessible. We cannot see beyond the horizon of the present. Prophecy steps into that void, offering not certainty but imagination. It gives us symbols to hold as we peer into the dark. In doing so, it transforms anxiety into anticipation. Even if the prophecy is never fulfilled, its very existence helps us live with uncertainty. It is not the accuracy of prophecy that sustains it, but its ability to give form to the formless. And so when we ask why prophecies endure, we find that the answer lies not in history or theology alone, but in psychology and the heart. Prophecy is less about foretelling the world's fate than about expressing the human condition. It speaks to our fear of chaos, our longing for meaning, our desire for control, our craving for hope, our love of mystery, and our hunger for belonging. It is a mirror, reflecting us back to ourselves, even as it pretends to speak of the future. Perhaps this is why prophecies continue to echo in our time. Whether we believe them literally, symbolically, or not at all, we cannot deny their hold. They whisper of endings and beginnings, of terror and hope, of darkness and dawn. In them we see not only the fate of the world, but the map of the human soul. And as long as we are human, as long as we fear, hope, and dream, prophecy will endure. Power is often imagined as cold, rational and calculating. A king weighing laws, a general studying maps, a president consulting data. Yet history tells a stranger, more unsettling story. For beneath the surface of official decrees and military orders, rulers across civilizations have bent their ears not to scholars or strategists, but to prophets, astrologers, and seers. Decisions that shape the fate of millions have at times been guided not by reason, but by riddles. The uneasy truth is that prophecy, far from being a harmless curiosity, has often infiltrated the highest levels of power. When kings and emperors listened, entire nations were steered by words whose meanings were ambiguous at best, disastrous at worst. From the crumbling marble of ancient temples to the polished corridors of modern governments, prophecy has had a peculiar grip on leaders. The attraction was obvious. If one ruled over vast lands and restless subjects, the greatest fear was the unknown future. Would rebellion strike? Would famine rot the harvest? Would the throne survive the weight of time? Prophecy seemed to offer an answer. To the lonely figure at the top of society, surrounded by flatterers and enemies, the words of a seer could feel like truth spoken from beyond the veil. And so, kings acted. One of the most chilling stories begins in ancient Greece, where the oracle of Delphi held sway over the ambitions of men. Croesus, king of Lydia, famous for his wealth, sought the oracle's counsel before launching war against Persia. The priestess's words were carefully ambiguous. If you cross the river, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus took this as divine assurance of victory. He crossed, he fought, and it was his own empire that was destroyed. Historians often tell the tale with a wry smile, but its implications are grim. A single prophecy, vague and slippery, led a king to catastrophe. Croesus was not the only ruler to fall victim to Delphi's riddles, but his case reveals the lethal danger of listening too closely. When power acts on prophecy, the consequences are never contained to the ruler alone. They cascade across armies, cities, and peoples. The Romans, heirs to both pragmatism and superstition, were no strangers to prophecy either. Julius Caesar himself, one of history's most calculating leaders, famously ignored, or half listened to, the warnings of seers. The Ides of March, though whispered by an anonymous soothsayer, lingered in the air as Caesar approached his last Senate meeting. He dismissed it, and history remembers the knives that followed. But perhaps more eerie than his death was the fact that Roman politics itself became entangled with prophecy. Emperors like Augustus wrapped their legitimacy in prophetic imagery, declaring themselves the fulfillment of old visions. Others, like Nero, became haunted by them. One prophecy spoke of the return of Nero, that after his supposed death he would rise again to torment Rome. This rumor was so widespread that multiple pretenders appeared across the empire, each claiming to be Nero returned. Here prophecy did more than frighten an emperor. It destabilized an empire, breathing life into impostors who could rally the discontented masses. Further east in China, emperors of the Han dynasty lived under the shadow of the mandate of heaven, itself a kind of prophetic doctrine. Natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, eclipses, were interpreted as heavenly signs of disapproval. Advisors, astrologers, and diviners wielded subtle but immense influence, for to declare that heaven had withdrawn its mandate was to call the emperor illegitimate. Some rulers executed seers for speaking such words, others reshaped their policies in desperation to prove the prophecy false. The line between governance and superstition blurred, and in that blur dynasties trembled. Consider also the medieval world, where prophecy and politics danced in uneasy union. The prophecies of Merlin, preserved in Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings, were treated not as legend, but as guides to the fate of Britain. Kings consulted them, interpreting battles and storms as proof of Merlin's words. In France, Joan of Arc emerged not only as a visionary, but as a living fulfillment of prophecy, an illiterate peasant girl who convinced a desperate king that God had chosen her to lead armies. Charles VII listened, and France was transformed. Yet the same prophetic aura that raised her also condemned her. When power no longer needed her visions, she was cast aside as a heretic. Leaders listened to prophecy only so long as it served their ends. When it no longer did, the seer was destroyed. The Renaissance, so often celebrated as the dawn of reason, was no less entangled with prophecy. Nostradamus, whose cryptic quatrains still circulate today, found favor in the French court. Catherine de' Medici, queen consort of Henry II, clutched his words as warnings and reassurances alike. During plague, famine, and political unrest, his verses were consulted as though they were weapons and shields. Imagine the candle-lit chambers of the Valois court, a queen reading verses by firelight, searching for hints of assassination or salvation. Policy and paranoia mingled in those moments, shaping how rulers acted toward allies and enemies. It was not simply poetry, it was power bending under prophecy's weight. Even in the modern age, when science and technology were supposed to banish superstition, leaders did not wholly escape prophecy's grasp. Adolf Hitler, despite his mechanized vision of empire, listened to astrologers and diviners. Heinrich Himmler, obsessed with occult prophecy, shaped elements of Nazi ideology around distorted myths of destiny. Churchill, too, though pragmatic, consulted mystics during the darkest nights of war, entertaining the idea that prophecy might hold keys to survival. And across the ocean, Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy were famously attentive to astrological advice, timing events and decisions in accordance with planetary alignments. These stories, though sometimes whispered as curiosities, point to an uneasy truth. Even in the age of data, those in power sometimes act as though prophecy still governs the invisible currents of history. The danger lies not only in leaders believing prophecy, but in how belief spreads downward. When rulers proclaim destiny, subjects often follow. A prophecy uttered by a court seer becomes propaganda, a tool to rally armies or justify conquests. The Crusades, for instance, were nourished by apocalyptic prophecies that framed war as the fulfillment of divine vision. Leaders invoked these words to sanctify violence, convincing thousands that their suffering was preordained. Prophecy, once adopted by power, becomes weaponized. Its ambiguity turns into certainty, its poetry into marching orders. And yet there is also the haunting reverse. Leaders destroyed by prophecy, they could not escape. Shakespeare dramatized this in Macbeth, but history provides its own versions. Consider Oedipus, the mythical king doomed by prophecy to kill his father and marry his mother, an ancient tale reflecting the terror of rulers caught in fate's web. Or think of the Russian Tsars, who lived in fear of Rasputin's cryptic words. Nicholas II clung to the mystic's assurances, ignoring political realities, until empire collapsed. The line between prophecy and manipulation blurred fatally, with Rasputin wielding power not through armies or gold, but through whispered visions. The uneasy thread running through all these stories is simple yet disturbing. When prophecy whispers, power listens, and the world trembles. History might have been written differently had Croesus ignored Delphi, had Catherine de' Medici dismissed Nostradamus, Had Nicholas II silenced Rasputin, or had Hitler refused occult fantasies? But they did not. Leaders are human, and like all humans, they fear the unknown. The difference is that when they listen to prophecy, the consequences echo across nations. What makes this truth most chilling is that prophecy thrives on ambiguity. No prophecy is ever clear until after the fact. Leaders, however, crave certainty. They bend vague words into definite meaning, acting as though riddles are maps. This tension, ambiguous prophecy, decisive power, creates tragedy. Croesus destroyed his empire. Caesar ignored his warning. Joan of Arc was burned, Rasputin rose and fell. Entire wars were waged under banners of divine destiny. The pattern is unmistakable. Prophecy, when it enters the halls of power, becomes more dangerous than any sword. And still, it endures. Even today, whispers of prophecy circle around modern figures. Predictions of assassinations, warnings of collapse, visions of a chosen leader. Such phrases still appear in media and in private circles of power. Leaders may laugh in public, but in private, many still look over their shoulders at the shadows of prophecy. The uneasy truth is that no matter how rational or advanced civilization becomes, prophecy retains its grip. Because rulers, like all, people are haunted by the question, what comes next? And if a prophecy claims to answer, they cannot help but listen. History is full of echoes, and prophecy is one of its loudest. Yet what if the prophecies that haunt our chronicles were never intended as calendars of doom, but as mirrors? What if they were not blueprints of inevitable disaster, but warnings, urgent? Messages left for us by voices who saw human nature clearly, perhaps more clearly than we see ourselves. To read prophecy as prediction is to assume that the future is fixed. To read it as warning is to realize that the future may still be shaped by choice. And so, in this chapter, we lean close to the words of the prophecy, not as passive listeners, awaiting fate, but as participants standing at a crossroads. The somber truth is that many prophecies carry a tone not of inevitability, but of caution. Their imagery, wars, floods, towers falling, empires collapsing, reflects not only visions of the future, but patterns from the past. Greed topples kings. Arrogance blinds rulers. Violence breeds ruin. Over and over, history has written these lessons in blood. The prophecy in this light may be less about foretelling what must come than about reminding us what will come if we do not change. It is a stern teacher, its language harsh, but its intention perhaps merciful. For warnings, however frightening, are given in hope that they might be heeded. Consider, for instance, the repeated emphasis in many prophetic texts on hubris. The ancient Greeks knew it well. Hubris invited nemesis. When mortals grew too proud, when they imagined themselves as gods, fate delivered a humbling. The prophecy we explore here carries the same chord. Leaders who ignore limits, societies that consume without measure, nations that glorify conquest, these are the ones who fall. And in our own age, the warnings ring louder than ever. Technology has given humanity tools once reserved for gods. The power to split atoms, to alter genes, to reshape climates. Yet wisdom has not kept pace with power. The prophecy's words describing skies darkened, waters poisoned, and fires spreading may sound like mystical allegory. But in our age, they resemble headlines. The warning in the words is not distant, it is present, burning like a signal fire. War is another constant theme. Prophecy after prophecy speaks of great battles, rivers running red, and cities reduced to ash. Skeptics dismiss this as melodrama. Yet anyone who has walked the ruins of once thriving places, Warsaw in 1945, Hiroshima after the blast, Aleppo in rubble, knows the imagery is not exaggerated. It is memory carried forward in poetic form. The warning is simple, though often ignored. Humanity's thirst for dominance leads not to glory, but to desolation. And perhaps the prophecy seeks not to tell us when the next war will come, but to plead with us to avoid it. Arrogance is perhaps the prophecy's central concern. Again and again, lines echo with images of towers rising too high, of rulers declaring themselves invincible, of civilizations believing themselves eternal. Yet every empire has fallen. Babylon, Rome, Byzantium, the great dynasties of China, the colonial powers of Europe. Each believed itself secure, yet each was eventually undone, not only by enemies, but by its own excesses, its own blindness. Two limits. The prophecy then is less about forecasting one particular collapse than about reminding us that collapse is the natural end of arrogance. The warning is not, "This empire shall fall." The warning is, every empire shall fall unless it learns humility. But humility is a rare virtue among nations. It is easier for individuals to bow their heads than for entire societies to do so. Here the prophecy takes on an almost parental tone, stern, repetitive, unwilling to let us escape its lesson. For thousands of years, prophets, seers, and poets have returned to the same warning. If we devour too much, we starve. If we exalt ourselves too highly, we fall. If we make war endlessly, we destroy not only our enemies, but ourselves. The fact that such warnings recur across cultures suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests that prophecy is less about predicting events than about preserving wisdom. Prophecies endure because humans forget. Each generation must be reminded anew. To listen closely to the prophecy in our age is to feel a mirror turned upon us. Climate change, with its rising seas and burning forests, eerily resembles the imagery of flood and fire in ancient verses. Political turmoil, with nations fracturing and leaders rising on tides of anger, echoes the warnings of division and pride. The staggering inequality of wealth, where some live in palaces while many starve, reflects the ancient admonitions against greed. The words were written long ago, but their warnings are unmistakably ours. And yet, a dangerous misunderstanding lies before us. Too often when people hear prophecy, they think the future is already written. It must happen, they say, the prophecy says so. This fatalism is itself a trap, for if prophecy is read only as prediction, we feel powerless. We accept destruction as destiny. But if prophecy is read as warning, then its power changes. It becomes not a chain binding us, but a lantern guiding us. The words no longer declare what will be, but caution what may be, unless we choose differently. This shift is crucial. The prophecy is not a cage, it is a signal flare. The somber tone of the prophecy may feel oppressive, but it is paradoxically hopeful. A warning implies that change is possible. If a mother warns a child not to touch the fire, she does not do so because the burn is inevitable, but because it can be avoided. The prophecy's visions of ruin, then, may not be destiny carved in stone, but attempts to shake us awake. To ignore them is to stumble forward blindly. To heed them is to step with care. Philosophers have long pondered the difference between fate and freedom. If everything is predetermined, then warnings are meaningless. But if the future is a tapestry woven by choice, then warnings are vital threads that prevent unraveling. Perhaps the prophecy exists to remind us that freedom is real but fragile, that while we cannot control all events, earthquakes will shake, storms will rage, we can control our greed, our violence, our arrogance, and by doing so, we may soften the blows of fate, or at least prevent ourselves from adding fuel to fire. Let us pause on the imagery of fire, for it appears again and again in prophetic language. Fire consumes, fire cleanses, fire transforms. In one sense, it is punishment, in another, renewal. The prophecy speaks of fire not only as destruction but as consequence. A city set ablaze is not always the work of gods, but of human pride and carelessness. In our age, we see forests burning due to both climate shifts and human negligence. We see bombs turning cities to flame. We see the fire of anger spreading through societies fractured by inequality and mistrust. The prophecies, fire then may not be mystical at all. It is the fire we ourselves unleash when we fail to heed warnings. Water too flows through the prophecy's warnings. Floods, rising seas, poisoned rivers, all symbols of chaos and cleansing. In earlier ages, these may have seemed like supernatural visions. To us, they feel painfully literal. The melting of glaciers, the drowning of coasts, the drying of once mighty rivers, all these echo the prophecy's words. But again, the message is less about inevitability than about consequence. The prophecy warns not because it delights in terror, but because it seeks to prevent it. The somber wisdom of prophecy, then, is that human nature does not change easily. We repeat mistakes generation after generation, empire after empire. That is why the warnings are so stark, so relentless. They must be. To break through the noise of daily life, to pierce the arrogance of kings and the apathy of citizens, prophecy speaks in thunder. Its tone is not gentle because gentleness is too easily ignored. The warning must be sharp because the danger is real. And yet, within that sharpness lies care. The prophecy does not exist to frighten for the sake of fear. It exists to teach. Every collapse it describes is meant to remind us that collapse can be avoided. Every vision of ruin is also a vision of a path not taken. The prophecy points to the abyss not to push us in, but to keep us from falling. The question then is whether we will listen. History suggests that we rarely do. Croesus at Delphi, Caesar on the Ides, Nicholas with Rasputin, warnings were given and warnings were ignored, and the price was paid. Will our age be different? Can we hear the warning not as myth but as urgent truth? The answer lies not in the prophecy, but in us. For the final and perhaps greatest warning within the words is this: prophecy is powerless without listeners. A warning unheeded is no warning at all. The somber truth is that the prophecy can only point. It cannot save. Salvation or destruction rests in human hands. And perhaps that is the ultimate message for our age. The words matter, but our choices matter more. History is full of echoes, and prophecy is one of its loudest. Yet what if the prophecies that haunt our chronicles were never intended as calendars of doom, but as mirrors? What if they were not blueprints of inevitable disaster, but warnings, urgent? Messages left for us by voices who saw human nature clearly, perhaps more clearly than we see ourselves. To read prophecy as prediction is to assume that the future is fixed. To read it as warning is to realize that the future may still be shaped by choice. And so, in this chapter, we lean close to the words of the prophecy, not as passive listeners, awaiting fate, but as participants standing at a crossroads. The somber truth is that many prophecies carry a tone not of inevitability, but of caution. Their imagery, wars, floods, towers falling, empires collapsing, reflects not only visions of the future, but patterns from the past. Greed topples kings. Arrogance blinds rulers. Violence breeds ruin. Over and over, history has written these lessons in blood. The prophecy in this light may be less about foretelling what must come than about reminding us what will come if we do not change. It is a stern teacher, its language harsh, but its intention perhaps merciful. For warnings, however frightening, are given in hope that they might be heeded. Consider, for instance, the repeated emphasis in many prophetic texts on hubris. The ancient Greeks knew it well. Hubris invited nemesis. When mortals grew too proud, when they imagined themselves as gods, fate delivered a humbling. The prophecy we explore here carries the same chord. Leaders who ignore limits, societies that consume without measure, nations that glorify conquest, these are the ones who fall. And in our own age, the warnings ring louder than ever. Technology has given humanity tools once reserved for gods. The power to split atoms, to alter genes, to reshape climates. Yet wisdom has not kept pace with power. The prophecy's words describing skies darkened, waters poisoned, and fires spreading may sound like mystical allegory. But in our age, they resemble headlines. The warning in the words is not distant. It is present, burning like a signal fire. War is another constant theme. Prophecy after prophecy speaks of great battles, rivers running red, and cities reduced to ash. Skeptics dismiss this as melodrama. Yet anyone who has walked the ruins of once thriving places, Warsaw in 1945, Hiroshima after the blast, Aleppo in rubble, knows the imagery is not exaggerated. It is memory carried forward in poetic form. The warning is simple, though often ignored. Humanity's thirst for dominance leads not to glory, but to desolation. And perhaps the prophecy seeks not to tell us when the next war will come, but to plead with us to avoid it. Arrogance is perhaps the prophecy's central concern. Again and again, lines echo with images of towers rising too high, of rulers declaring, themselves invincible, of civilizations believing themselves eternal. Yet every empire has fallen. Babylon, Rome, Byzantium, the great dynasties of China, the colonial powers of Europe. Each believed itself secure, yet each was eventually undone, not only by enemies, but by its own excesses, its own blindness. Two limits. The prophecy then is less about forecasting one particular collapse than about reminding us that collapse is the natural end of arrogance. The warning is not, "This empire shall fall." The warning is, every empire shall fall unless it learns humility. But humility is a rare virtue among nations. It is easier for individuals to bow their heads than for entire societies to do so. Here the prophecy takes on an almost parental tone, stern, repetitive, unwilling to let us escape its lesson. For thousands of years, prophets, seers, and poets have returned to the same warning. If we devour too much, we starve. If we exalt ourselves too highly, we fall. If we make war endlessly, we destroy not only our enemies, but ourselves. The fact that such warnings recur across cultures suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests that prophecy is less about predicting events than about preserving wisdom. Prophecies endure because humans forget. Each generation must be reminded anew. To listen closely to the prophecy in our age is to feel a mirror turned upon us. Climate change, with its rising seas and burning forests, eerily resembles the imagery of flood and fire in ancient verses. Political turmoil, with nations fracturing and leaders rising on tides of anger, echoes the warnings of division and pride. The staggering inequality of wealth, where some live in palaces while many starve, reflects the ancient admonitions against greed. The words were written long ago, but their warnings are unmistakably ours. And yet, a dangerous misunderstanding lies before us. Too often when people hear prophecy, they think the future is already written. It must happen, they say, the prophecy says so. This fatalism is itself a trap, for if prophecy is read only as prediction, we feel powerless. We accept destruction as destiny. But if prophecy is read as warning, then its power changes. It becomes not a chain binding us, but a lantern guiding us. The words no longer declare what will be, but caution what may be, unless we choose differently. This shift is crucial. The prophecy is not a cage, it is a signal flare. The somber tone of the prophecy may feel oppressive, but it is paradoxically hopeful. A warning implies that change is possible. If a mother warns a child not to touch the fire, she does not do so because the burn is inevitable, but because it can be avoided. The prophecy's visions of ruin, then, may not be destiny carved in stone, but attempts to shake us awake. To ignore them is to stumble forward blindly. To heed them is to step with care. Philosophers have long pondered the difference between fate and freedom. If everything is predetermined, then warnings are meaningless. But if the future is a tapestry woven by choice, then warnings are vital threads that prevent unraveling. Perhaps the prophecy exists to remind us that freedom is real but fragile, that while we cannot control all events, earthquakes will shake, storms will rage, we can control our greed, our violence, our arrogance, and by doing so, we may soften the blows of fate, or at least prevent ourselves from adding fuel to fire. Let us pause on the imagery of fire, for it appears again and again in prophetic language. Fire consumes, fire cleanses, fire transforms. In one sense, it is punishment, in another, renewal. The prophecy speaks of fire not only as destruction but as consequence. A city set ablaze is not always the work of gods, but of human pride and carelessness. In our age, we see forests burning due to both climate shifts and human negligence. We see bombs turning cities to flame. We see the fire of anger spreading through societies fractured by inequality and mistrust. The prophecies, fire then may not be mystical at all. It is the fire we ourselves unleash when we fail to heed warnings. Water too flows through the prophecy's warnings. Floods, rising seas, poisoned rivers, all symbols of chaos and cleansing. In earlier ages, these may have seemed like supernatural visions. To us, they feel painfully literal. The melting of glaciers, the drowning of coasts, the drying of once mighty rivers, all these echo the prophecy's words. But again, the message is less about inevitability than about consequence. The prophecy warns not because it delights in terror, but because it seeks to prevent it. The somber wisdom of prophecy, then, is that human nature does not change easily. We repeat mistakes generation after generation, empire after empire. That is why the warnings are so stark, so relentless. They must be. To break through the noise of daily life, to pierce the arrogance of kings and the apathy of citizens, prophecy speaks in thunder. Its tone is not gentle because gentleness is too easily ignored. The warning must be sharp because the danger is real. And yet, within that sharpness lies care. The prophecy does not exist to frighten for the sake of fear. It exists to teach. Every collapse it describes is meant to remind us that collapse can be avoided. Every vision of ruin is also a vision of a path not taken. The prophecy points to the abyss not to push us in, but to keep us from falling. The question then is whether we will listen. History suggests that we rarely do. Croesus at Delphi, Caesar on the Ides, Nicholas with Rasputin, warnings were given and warnings were ignored, and the price was paid. Will our age be different? Can we hear the warning not as myth but as urgent truth? The answer lies not in the prophecy, but in us. For the final and perhaps greatest warning within the words is this: prophecy is powerless without listeners. A warning unheeded is no warning at all. The somber truth is that the prophecy can only point. It cannot save. Salvation or destruction rests in human hands. And perhaps that is the ultimate message for our age. The words matter, but our choices matter more. Every story, no matter how vast, must come to its end. But prophecies are different. They are stories that never truly finish. They hover like half-written sentences, waiting for someone, perhaps us, to complete them. And so, as we arrive at the final chapter of this journey, we find ourselves face to face not with certainty, but with a question. What does it all mean? The prophecy began as a whisper in ancient times, words etched on parchment, murmured by seers, carried on the tongues of travelers, copied by scribes who could not know the weight of what they preserved. Then, as centuries passed, the prophecy slipped into shadow. Lost manuscripts vanished into libraries of dust. Fires consumed scrolls, wars scattered archives. Skeptics dismissed it as myth. For a long time, it seemed the prophecy was gone forever. And yet, it returned. Fragments surfaced in monasteries. Echoes appeared in other civilizations' texts. Then, most chillingly, passages emerged that seemed to describe our own age with uncanny precision. Images of towers falling, oceans rising, leaders blinded by their own hubris, wars breaking out as though scripted by the past. All these came back to us word for word. It was as though the prophecy had been waiting, concealed in silence, until the moment arrived when its words would strike deepest. But what are we to make of this reappearance? That is the haunting question. Did the prophecy truly foresee our age across the gulf of centuries? Or is it we who give it power, who twist its imagery to fit the shapes of our fears? Perhaps the truth lies not in the prophecy itself, but in us, the readers, the listeners, the believers who breathe life into dead words. This brings us to the forbidden thought. What if prophecy is less about destiny and more about self-fulfilling belief? Imagine a leader, convinced that the prophecy describes him, shaping his decisions to match the words. Imagine a people, terrified of what has been written, unconsciously guiding their world toward it. If enough people believe a prophecy is real, then in a sense, it becomes real. The words, once powerless ink, acquire flesh in the choices we make. This paradox is at the heart of all prophecy. If we ignore it, do we prove it false, or do we merely delay its fulfillment? If we heed it, do we escape fate, or do we walk directly into it by trying too hard to avoid it? The prophecy becomes a mirror, reflecting our deepest anxieties back at us, and like all mirrors it can deceive. We see ourselves, but distorted. We see the future, but only the future we fear most. The haunting power of prophecy lies here. It blurs the line between fate and freedom. On the one hand, it seems to say this will happen. On the other, it whispers this may happen if you let it. The unfinished line of prophecy is the space between these two interpretations. It does not tell us whether we are trapped in destiny or whether destiny is only a shadow we cast upon ourselves. It leaves the sentence incomplete, the meaning unresolved, because resolution belongs not to the past but to us. As we think about this, history once again reminds us of the spiral. How many times have words shaped reality? When oracles told kings of their doom, kings acted in ways that brought that doom upon them. When prophets spoke of floods and fire, societies trembled and reshaped their lives, sometimes averting disaster, sometimes inviting it. When revolutionaries declared, "The old order is doomed," their declaration helped summon the very uprising they described. Prophecy is not simply a forecast, it is an actor in history, a voice that bends human will. This is why the reappearance of the prophecy in our own time feels so uncanny. It is not just that the words match the images of our headlines. It is that we, by reading them, cannot help but internalize them. We ask ourselves, what if this is true? And in asking, we begin to behave as though it might be true. We prepare for disaster. We speak of doom. We shape policy from fear. The prophecy begins to live again, animated not by divine command, but by human imagination. Here, then, is the greatest danger of all. Belief is power. Words shape worlds. If we believe too strongly that destruction is inevitable, then destruction becomes inevitable, not because the prophecy demanded it, but because we surrendered to its spell. The unfinished line is not a riddle waiting for us to solve. It is our choice waiting for us to make. By believing or disbelieving, by acting or refusing, we become the authors of the final sentence. But perhaps there is a deeper way of seeing. Perhaps prophecy endures not because it enslaves us, but because it reminds us. It does not exist to force us toward ruin, but to caution us against it. The language of fire and flood, of arrogance and fall may be less a prediction than a warning. The prophets of old were not trying to bind us to fate, but to shake us awake. They knew human beings forget. They knew history repeats. And so they set their warnings in language so stark, so unforgettable, that even centuries later it would still ring like a bell in our minds. The unfinished line, then, is not a curse but an invitation. It invites us to ask, what will we choose? Will we take the warning seriously, or will we dismiss it as coincidence? Will we repeat the spiral blindly, or will we learn? The prophecy remains unfinished precisely because we are the ones who must finish it. Its meaning is not in the parchment or the ink, but in the living choices of the present. There is a calm horror in this realization. We cannot blame the past for our fate. We cannot hide behind destiny. If the prophecy comes true, it may not be because it was written in the stars, but because we allowed ourselves to be guided by fear, greed, and arrogance. If it does not come true, it may not be because the prophecy failed, but because we chose differently. The power lies not in the seer's voice, but in ours. And yet, even as we say this, the unease remains. What if there truly is destiny? What if the prophecy was not just metaphor but vision? What if the spiral cannot be broken, no matter how wisely we act? The haunting power of prophecy is that we cannot know. We are left suspended between two truths, that we are free and that we are bound. The prophecy's words do not resolve this tension, they embody it. Perhaps this is why prophecy never dies. Skeptics debunk it, scholars dismiss it, believers clutch it to their hearts, but always the words return. They surface in times of crisis, when the world feels fragile, when we sense the spiral tightening again. They return because they speak to something deeper than fact or fiction. They speak to the human condition itself, our fear of what lies. Ahead, our hope that we might endure, our desperate need to find meaning in chaos. And so the prophecy endures because we endure. It is unfinished because we are unfinished. Until the final chapter of humanity is written, until the last word of our story is set down, prophecy will remain suspended in that haunting space between fate and freedom. It will remain a mirror we cannot look away from, a voice we cannot silence, a question we cannot answer. As this chapter closes, the camera lingers on silence, pages flutter, the candle burns low. The words of the prophecy written centuries ago hang in the air like smoke. And then comes the echo, the forbidden question, spoken at last. Is this destiny, or are we fulfilling it ourselves by believing in it? The line remains unfinished. The answer belongs not to the past nor to the prophets, but to us. The flame burns low. Its light, once steady, now trembles. Shadows stretch across parchment, across stone, across memory itself. We have walked a long road through centuries of whispers and warnings, through the uneasy terrain of belief and doubt, through the spiral where past and future seem to meet. And now, at the end of our journey, we find ourselves back where we began, in a quiet room, with only a single candle to guide us. It is here, in this hush, that the question must be asked, not with thunder but with silence. What does it mean, this prophecy that has haunted us from the edges of history? What is it telling us, or asking of us? We cannot answer with certainty. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps prophecy was never meant to hand us solutions, but to hand us questions, to leave us unsettled, to disturb the still water of our minds so that we might see deeper. Like the candle's flame, prophecy flickers, not steady illumination, but shifting light, half shadow, half fire. In that flicker, we glimpse possibilities. In that flicker, we see ourselves. For across these pages and across these stories, one truth has emerged again and again. Prophecy survives not because it is written, but because it is remembered. It survives not because of fate, but because of us. The words endure because we carry them. The parchment may fade, the ink may crack, the scroll may turn to dust, but the human heart remembers, and in remembering, we give prophecy its power. That is the mystery at the center of everything. Why do we feel its pull? Why does a fragment of old word send shivers through us still? Is it because deep down we sense some hidden truth? Or is it simply because prophecy speaks to our most human fears, the fear of tomorrow, the fear of loss, the fear that we are not in control? Consider this. Every prophecy in every civilization has carried two threads woven tightly together. One thread is fear, the fire, the flood, the fall of empires, the silence after ruin. The other is hope, the survival of a remnant, the dawn after darkness, the idea that knowing the danger might give us strength to change. To listen to prophecy is to live inside both threads at once. We are terrified, but we are also reminded that choice remains. That is why prophecy never quite dies. Kings may suppress it, scholars may dismiss it, wars may scatter its scrolls, but the words always return because the need they answer is eternal. Humanity longs to know what lies ahead. Humanity longs for meaning in the storm. And so, even when a prophecy is forgotten, new ones rise in its place. Different language, different symbols, but the same hunger at the root, the same candle, relit again and again across time. And here we are at the present. Our age, with its glowing screens and restless cities, is not so different from the worlds that came before. We too feel the fragility of the moment. We too sense that the spiral of history tightens around us. We too listen, whether we admit it or not, for voices that might tell us what tomorrow brings. The prophecy has returned not only because it was preserved, but because we are ready to hear it again. Yet we must be careful, for prophecy is double-edged. It can awaken us, but it can also ensnare us. To believe too strongly may be to give it life in ways we do not intend. To dismiss it too quickly may be to miss its warning. The truth lies not at the extremes but in the balance, the ability to listen without surrender, to question without closing our hearts. And so, as the candle burns lower, we are left with an unfinished line. The prophecy does not tell us whether our future is doomed or saved. It does not tell us whether destiny is written or chosen. It does not even tell us whether the words themselves were vision or invention. It leaves the space open, waiting like a blank page for us to write. That is the final gift of prophecy, the reminder that the story is not over. We are still writing it every day in every choice. History's spiral may tighten, but it is not yet closed. The line remains unfinished because we remain unfinished. The mystery is not out there, in the stars or the scrolls. It is here, in us. Perhaps that is why the image of the candle lingers so strongly. A candle gives only a small light, never enough to banish all darkness. And yet it is enough to see by, enough to keep us moving, enough to keep us alive in the night. Prophecy is like that. It does not show us everything, but it shows us enough to ask, enough to wonder, enough to search. And so the circle closes. We began with parchment, with candlelight, with a voice from centuries past. We end in the same place, the same hush, but now the voice is different. It is no longer only the seer's, it is ours. Because in the end, the greatest mystery is not the prophecy itself, but why we feel its pull, why the words of the dead still shape the choices of the living. Why we cannot turn away from the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, the future is already whispering to us. The candle gutters. Its flame bends, stretches, and almost disappears. In the final moment, it steadies one last time, a single breath of light before the dark. And as it fades, so too does the voice, leaving us not with an answer, but with a question carried gently into silence. The words were spoken once. Now they live again in us,